All right, good afternoon, everyone. We are at quorum now, so we'd like to get started. For the record, the time is now 1:05, and we have begun the Assembly Bill 32 Environmental Justice Advisory Committee public meeting. Welcome. My name is Jane Harrington from Leading Resources, Inc., and I'm the facilitator for today's meeting. I'm happy to be here with you all today. Before we start with the order of business, housekeeping will be covered on Zoom to facilitate public comment period and a few critical details related to the Sacramento facilities. Spanish interpretation will be provided in the Zoom Spanish channel for the duration of the meeting. We have 2 interpreters to support today's meeting. For those in the building, restrooms are outside the door to the left and down the hall by the drinking fountains. In case of an emergency, please exit out the door to the right and down the stairs. We will have public comment periods today. As a reminder, please limit your comments to that agenda item. And while EJAC welcomes your comments, committee members will not be responding to public comment. For members of the public participating remotely, you will be able to raise your hand in Zoom to speak during the public comment period. When it's your turn, the host will ask you to unmute, and after you click on the unmute button from your end, you may begin to speak. We will be switching off between commenters in the room and commenters attending virtually on Zoom. We intend to give every commenter 3 minutes to speak, and we'll let you know if any changes are required based on the volume of comments. In the event that *6 does not work to unmute, CARB will work on this end to unmute you. We appreciate you staying on mute until it's your turn to speak, to be respectful of everyone's turn. And before providing your question or comment, please state your name and affiliation, if applicable, so that we know who is speaking. We will do our best to do the same in the room for members of the public to know who is speaking. Zoom Q&A and chat functions are turned off for participants. And now I'd like to introduce our Spanish interpreter that is on the line in the main channel. Carlos, if you could please introduce yourself and translate the information on this slide.
And gladly. Good afternoon. My name is Carlos, as has been stated. I am one of the 2 Spanish interpreters for this meeting. Muy buenas tardes. Su servidor Carlos, uno de los 2 intérpretes para la reunión de hoy. En pantalla se brinda orientación para quienes participan vía Zoom. Si se comunicaron vía telefónica para participar, 1, les comentamos que no habrá interpretación disponible, pero 2, si desean permanecer vía telefónica, cuando llegue su turno para hacer comentarios, deberá marcar *6 para activar el sonido y nuevamente para silenciarlo, y él marcará el número 2 para levantar su mano virtual. Thank you.
Thank you. For those who are participating, in person, to prevent echoes, we request that you click on the symbol next to the unmute button, as seen in item number 1 on the screen. Next, select Leave Computer Audio, as seen in item number 2 on the screen. And also, please make sure to stay muted for the full duration of the meeting to avoid background noise. Carlos, please provide the translated information.
Si nos acompaña presencialmente e ingresa a la sesión vía Zoom, será necesario, para evitar ecos y que se vicie el sonido, abandonar el audio de la computadora. Para hacerlo, junto al icono del micrófono, verá un símbolo que aparece con el número 1 en pantalla. Le da clic y en la pantalla desplegable seleccionaría abandonar audio de computadora o Leave Computer Audio, como aparece en el número 2, y por favor dejar su micrófono en mudo durante toda la reunión. Gracias.
Thank you. Next, we will provide instructions, and then we will enable the Zoom interpretation features. When the interpretation globe appears at the bottom right corner of Zoom, as seen in item number 1 on the screen, please choose your preferred language as English or Spanish, as seen in item number 2. Carlos, please provide these instructions in Spanish.
Gladly. Buenas tardes. Se está ofreciendo interpretación simultánea. Para ello, en la barra de controles de Zoom, en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla, como ve en el número 1 en la ilustración, aparece un icono de interpretación que parece un globo terráqueo. Simplemente le da clic y selecciona español como su idioma.
Thank you.
Thank
If
you.
for any reason you require technical Zoom support in today's meeting, please contact CARB staff Bobby Rooch, who is in person here in Sacramento, by email as provided on this slide. We will do our best to assist you. Today's meeting is being recorded. CARB staff will post to the EJAC Meetings and Events website in the coming weeks. This is the same website where you can find all materials for today's meeting as provided on this slide. Carlos, could you please provide the translation?
Gladly. Si necesita ayuda para resolver algún problema técnico, favor de comunicarse con Bobby Rooch, quien se encuentra presente en la sala, vía correo electrónico, como aparece en esta diapositiva, y haremos todo lo posible por apoyarles. Esta reunión se está grabando y los materiales de la reunión estarán disponibles en la página web del Comité Asesor en Justicia Ambiental de la Junta de Recursos Atmosféricos del Estado de California, donde también aparecen el resto de los materiales para este programa. Gracias.
Thank you. With that, I would like to begin the EJAC member roll call. As a reminder, this is the formal record of meeting attendance, and therefore we ask that all EJAC members respond when your name is called. Please state here your affiliation, pronouns, and if you are on or off camera, and if off, the reason for doing so consistent with our meeting requirements. For the EJAC members who join the meeting later, we will be asking them to verbally announce their attendance in the same fashion so it's clear to all participants. So to begin, Martha Dina Arguello.
Present, Marta Dina Arguello with Physicians for Social Responsibility, she, her pronouns.
Thank you. Juan Flores.
Good afternoon, everyone. Juan Flores with the Center on Race, Poverty, and Development, and I use he, him pronouns.
Thank you. Dr. Catherine Garupa.
Catherine Garupa, Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, or CVAC, they and she pronouns present here in the room.
Thank you. Kevin Hamilton.
Kevin Hamilton, Medical Advocates for Healthy Air. I am on the phone fighting with my computer to get access and get it working again after the internet crash here. So I'll get on the camera at that point.
Thank you.
I'm off for now.
John Harriel Jr. Thomas Helm.
Hey everybody, Tom Helm. Apologize for my voice that I'm losing right now. Co-founder of Valley Improvement Projects, he, him, his. I'm attending virtually. I might have to turn my video off. I just got an alert from Spectrum that there might be outages. It's very windy and raining here, but I will try to leave it on as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt Holmes.
President Matt Holmes, California Environmental Justice Coalition, or CEJC, he, him pronouns, voice shot as well, and also in the part of California that can't handle rain, be advised.
Thank you. Understood.
That would be the whole state.
John Kevin Jefferson III. Ray Leone. Luis Almeida. Jill Sherman Warren. All right, that concludes roll call with 6 in attendance. I will now turn it over to our co-chairs to provide an overview of today's meeting agenda.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Catherine again. I will do a quick overview of the agenda and then pass it to you, Martha Dina, for our meeting agreements. We will do introductions and opening remarks and then review quarter 3 and quarter 4 public meeting minutes. Because this is potentially an action item, we will stop for public comment specifically on those minutes. And then if the committee so pleases, we will take a motion on approving those minutes. We have item number 7 about CARB providing an update on the EJAC charter. Then we will receive a presentation from the research division about their 5-year strategic research plan and methane satellite data community engagement efforts. Then there will be space for EJAC questions on the CARB research presentation. We will take a break. We will hear a presentation about the Air Resources Board's 2025 priorities, then an item on EJAC's 2025 priorities, a second opportunity for public comment on all of those items, and then we will conclude with next steps and closing remarks. Over to you, Martha Dina.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. So we should all be very familiar with our EJAC meeting agreements. Pay attention to equity of airtime, be present, be open and flexible, be realistic, and we do have a big agenda today, so we can monitor our ability to get through the full agenda. We seek out synergy, and we try to do yes and building on each other's ideas and work. If virtual, keep your cameras on throughout, noting all the issues with the rain and internet. And mine is also unstable, and I'm in Los Angeles, so I don't know that any part of the state deals with rain. Anyways, if you're going to go off camera, let us know so that that you're off camera but still in the meeting, so we can maintain quorum. You can notify the staff or the co-chairs through the text. Listen and be compassionate and supportive. Reach for and invite inspiration and intuition. Look for ways to move toward action where possible. Respect the agenda and trust the process. Share responsibilities for success. And with that, I will pass it to Catherine for her opening comments.
I believe we will move to CARB first for opening comments.
Sorry.
Hi all, so welcome. For those that don't know, my name is Chanel Fletcher. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer of Equity, Communities, and Environmental Justice at the California Air Resources Board. I do want to say to everyone joining, right, members of the public, EJAC members, CARB deputies in the chair's office who are here with us, whether it's online or in the room, thank you so much for being here. As everyone has shared, similar to me, I also have rain going on, so my internet is unstable as well, but I will try to be present and on camera. And I think as Dr. Catherine shared, today CARB staff will present on a couple of pertinent topics for the EJAC, and then I will share CARB's 2025 priorities. I do hope that hearing our priorities will really help the EJAC as all of you are thinking about the year and what you would like to advise the board on as it relates to AB 32 implementation. Today, our research team will present on our 5-year strategic research plan, and they will provide an update on our efforts to incorporate environmental justice in that plan. Our research team will also present on the methane satellite data community engagement effort. We'll provide an overview of the work and some of the next steps. Again, I think our hope really is that with these presentations and hearing those priorities for the year will really help for the EJAC as you're thinking about what areas of engagement you want to focus on in this year. I also did want to address a request that was brought up at the October EJAC meeting, and it was to receive CARB's bylaws. So I wanted to follow up and just make sure that everyone knew that the CARB board is governed by statutes, which are available at the Health and Safety Code. Those sections are 39500 through 39600. So those statutes don't apply to the EJAC because they're an advisory board or an advisory body to our board, and that the EJAC legislation is in Health and Safety Code section 38591 with additional specific guidelines that are provided in the 2023 EJAC charter. I did say a lot of health and safety code sections, so if it's helpful, we can follow up by email to share those specific health and safety code sections that govern the CARB board as well as the one that govern or set up for the EJAC. So wanted to make sure I followed up on that one as well. And with that said, I will now turn it over to our EJAC co-chairs to provide their opening remarks and to kick us off in our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Jane Harrington, the facilitator for the meeting. Noticing that we've got a couple of committee members that have joined us since I did roll call, I'd like to invite them to state their presence for the record, along with their affiliation and pronouns. I will go to Jill first. Jill Sherman-Warren.
I'm so sorry. I'm having problems. Jill Sherman Warren, Hoopa tribal member, executive director of NAPAC, and also will remain off camera. It actually would be ultimate for me to have no cameras and with no video, but unfortunately, I can't do that. So, that's me.
Thank you. And going to the room, Luis, could you please state your affiliation and pronouns so we have you for the record? Luis Almeida.
Luis Olmedo, Executive Director with Comité Cívico del Valle. Present.
Thank you. Good to have everyone. I will turn it back over to the co-chairs, going to Dr. Catherine.
Good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to the first EJAC meeting of 2025. My thoughts go out to survivors of climate catastrophes recently, like the wildfires in Los Angeles, and I do believe that the work we do here at EJAC and our calls to action are also well aligned in trying to draw urgent attention to those issues. So I don't want to just leave it at thoughts. I also want to acknowledge that politically, the dynamics of our work continue to shift. At the federal level, we're now seeing a move towards environmental justice being treated as if it's a bad word. The state continues to use the term environmental justice, but oftentimes what we see is that the actions don't follow. While I appreciate that the research division today will talk about the ways that they're trying to integrate environmental justice priorities, and that CARB will provide a general overview of their 2025 priorities, I personally am still waiting for a vision and goals from CARB for how to work collaboratively with EJAC. That being said, we do have an item in the opportunity today to talk about what priorities we would like to focus on. It's also top of mind for me that we have 1 year left on our existing term as EJAC members, and to be proud of the fact that we continue to hold this space for meaningful conversations. So as we move into this year, what may be the last year for many of us, thinking about how we continue to do that together. Earlier this week, I convened the Cap and Trade Work Group. The rulemaking has been delayed by CARB, and the conversations in the legislature about legislative extension are ongoing. So we do anticipate this being a topic of discussion for us this year. And at our last meeting in November 2024 was very, again, pleased with the fact that we were able to adopt a resolution despite CARB leadership essentially telling us to take our recommendations to the legislature. It's important that we still speak our truth and uplift what our priorities are. There's also a lot of conversations going on right now that we as a body have discussed for years about the rising cost of living in California and the fact that our economy is incredibly unequal, and our frontline environmental justice communities continue to bear the brunt of the pollution and the health and economic costs of the existing carbon regime. So all of that being said, as a body, we certainly have a lot of work to do. And as parts of the environmental justice movement for the state of California and the United States, I appreciate our members for uplifting the priorities of your local communities and showing up here today virtually and in person despite the weather. And with that, I'll pass it to Martha Dina.
Thanks. I also want to lift up that the fires remind us of many of the things that the environmental justice community has been saying for a long time, right? That we should, as we address climate change, that we should also focus on air pollution, that we need to look at all of the practices that are driving climate change, including the building materials we use, the chemicals that are used, that all come from petrochemicals that are all driving climate change, but are also making fires a lot more toxic. And so that we've been supporting families who are figuring out how to go back to their homes, and no one is responsible for the indoor air quality. And so we continue to sort of work in an environment that negates the needs of our communities, and in a regulatory function, in a regulatory scheme that continues to only play at the margins of the problem. And I know it's not for us to solve here, and that this is one of those unresolved issues. But I hope that CARB and the state of California recommits, given what the national government is doing to protecting people hit first and worst by climate, that we need to make sure that people can breathe clean air, and that the state of California and CARB actually become the thing that they say they are, that they're actually standing for the people who are most vulnerable and figuring out and being bold in the face of climate change and in the face of a government, a national government that is retracting from many of our obligations. And with that, I'm done, and we can move on to our next item.
Thank you. And this is Jane Harrington, the facilitator for the meeting. For the purposes of the record, I see that we do have another committee member who has joined us. So I would like to invite Ray Leone to state his presence for the record, his affiliation, and his pronouns. Ray, are you with us online?
Sorry, I'm fumbling with my phone right now. Ray Leon, Executive Director of the LEAP Institute, Mayor, City of Huron. Good to be with everybody here today.
Thank you. Good to have you. We will now move to the next item on the agenda. It is the Q3 and Q4 2024 EJAC public meeting minutes. So we will now be posting minutes from EJAC public meetings. To get us current, we would like to review and adopt minutes from August 16th, September 3rd, October 11th, and November 14th, 2024 meetings. Any discussion from the committee on that? As a reminder to everyone, all materials for today's meeting, including the past meeting minutes, are posted on the EJAC website.
So I do have one question. Now that we are producing minutes, will these minutes replace the recordings of the meetings?
Thanks for the question, Martha Dina. This is Ashley Giorgio from CARB. No, there will be both minutes from the meeting as well as the meeting recording on the public webpage.
Thank you.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, this is just to share that I reviewed the minutes. They look consistent. I do have, an item from the November meeting where we flagged discussing the natural working lands recommendations from the EB 1757, but obviously that can come up later when we talk about goals for this year.
Thank you.
But if you need a motion to say that they look consistent, or everybody needs to say they look consistent if they haven't looked at them yet, so be it.
Thank you. So I hear a possible motion, and we will pause for public comment, but I'll wait to see if there's any additional discussion from committee members before going to public comment.
This is Dr. Catherine. I'll just confess that because this is the first time we were doing this and it's a busy time of year, I have not been able to read through all of the minutes. So at this moment, I'm not comfortable personally taking action on them.
Thank you.
And that's enough for me to withdraw my motion.
Thank you, Matt. The motion has been withdrawn. I'll pause. Any additional comments or discussion from the committee members?
This is Juan Flores. I would also appreciate perhaps not taking action today, so I could more truly review the minutes. As Matt mentioned, they look consistent on the formatting, but I haven't been able to go through them in detail to make a conscientious vote today.
Thank you, Juan.
I'm in agreement. This is Jill.
Thank you, Jill. At this time, it sounds like we will not be prepared as a committee to make a motion on this item. I think the suggestion might be to bring this up at a later meeting for action. To that end, we will go ahead and take public comment on this item. If you would like to make public comment on this item, please raise your hand. If you're in the room, please step to the podium. I'll give it a moment, but seeing no hands raised online, noting for the record, we have about 68 virtual attendees. And looking to the room, seeing no one at the podium. That concludes public comment on this item. We will now move to the next agenda item, which is CARB's update on the EJAC charter. I'm going to pause one moment. Luis, did you have a comment?
I did want to make a comment to the public comment. Fact that it's so important to continue to engage the community for California Air Resources Board and all state government more than ever to continue to practice the best practices whenever California agencies, including CARB or CalEPA, has felt proud and said, this is phenomenal. This is the best we've done to engage community, whether, they're comments that are fair, or unfair, out of context, or phenomenal. They praise CARB in all government, because this is more of a general comment for everyone. Obviously, we're here at CARB. We are living a time right now where more than ever, we need to engage community. California has always been a very progressive state. We're always looking out for Californians and anyone else who travels through California or anyone else who's impacted by California's policies and benefits. And so I don't know. The fact that we have no public comment, is that an indicator that we're living very difficult times? So more than ever, California needs to engage the public. And I'm not saying that anything CARB did, but there could be many reasons why there is no public comment. But it is an indicator to me that we need people may be harder to reach. I know that this agenda is going to be impactful to a lot of people. And I know there's a lot of things that in the past, especially when there has been in significant investment on environmental justice. I have seen for a few years now that that investment is dwindling. Yeah, sure, there's grants, sure, there's other things, but the welcoming, the deliberate, the discussions about disadvantaged communities, about equity, about inclusion, about disadvantaged communities, it's not the same. As someone who works, and I imagine all of us here who are part of this Environmental Justice Advisory, we're front lines. We're there. And if I can tell you, from my own experience, I can only talk for me and my community, there's a lot of room to get back to where we were on that front and continue to grow from there, because California and CARB and every agency in the state of California at one point will have to turn to community and say, hey, our federal funding is going, right? We need you. And if we're not investing like we did before, guess what? People may not be willing to step up and say, why? California forgot about us because they closed the doors on environmental justice and equity and inclusion. I'm not saying that that's the case. We still live in a great state of California that has made those commitments. But I have to say that from a few years ago to where we're at today, it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel that way. So it's a word of caution, as a word of advice. If we are not getting people here to public comment, it's probably because we're not trying hard enough to engage people. So, thank you.
Thank you. And noting for the record, we will have additional opportunities for public comment in today's meeting. We will now turn to agenda item number 7, which is the CARB update on the EJAC charter. I'll turn it over to CARB staff.
Thanks, Jane. I think this is me. I'll be brief. So I just wanted to flag that in late 2024, we started discussing potential revisions to the EJAC charter. CARB has met with the EJAC charter subgroup on 2 separate occasions. So in October 2024 and also in January 2025. And that was really kind of to share our thoughts, hear that subgroup's thoughts on how we can best proceed forward with this charter update. I did want to flag for everyone that Resolution 2310 states that we need to report back to the board on the charter review by April 2025. On our end, I think we'll continue to meet with that EJAC charter subgroup to really think through how we develop a path forward on this charter update. And I think the goal is to kind of bring back those updates back to the EJAC in our March and April public meetings. I know there are other folks that are on the EJAC charter subgroup. So if anyone else from the EJAC wants to chime in, happy to have other folks kind of chime in. Otherwise, I'm happy to also just turn it back to you, Jane.
Thank you. Any discussion or comments from EJAC committee members? That takes us to agenda item number 8, which is CARB presentations. We'll start with a 5-year strategic research plan and future research priorities. I will turn it over to CARB staff.
Thank you so much. And I believe someone is sharing slides for me.
Yes, we will take care of that.
Great. I'm Elizabeth Shealy. I'm head of the research division, and I just want to thank you for having me here today to talk about the research plan and our 5-year plan. I'm going to provide an update on our 5-year strategic research plan and the planning process. Next slide. The CARB research program was legislatively mandated in 1971 and is an essential part of CARB's mission to enact air pollution and climate change measures that are grounded in sound science and data to support our various programs. The research program uses internal and external coordination to understand research needs related to CARB priorities. Our program is also informed by emerging topics in air pollution and climate change. We collaborate with other agencies and outside entities to inform CARB programs. CARB's research program has an annual budget of about $4 to $8 million and we can fund around 10 to 12 research projects a year. Next slide. We create a strategic research plan to aid us in our planning and outreach efforts. The next plan will cover fiscal years 2025 to 2030. We anticipate the proposed plan going to the June board hearing, and a draft version will be available for a 30-day comment period. The plan is developed through a public process, including public meetings and surveys. For the upcoming 5-year plan, we also worked with community-based organizations and held a series of community meetings. These plans provide details and clarity on our planning process and help guide the public and public partners in collaborating with us. They lay out the future research priorities that are informed by the public process, by CARB's mission and jurisdiction, upcoming regulations, and upcoming air quality and climate goals. In 2021, the plan outlined our greater emphasis on racial equity and environmental justice in our research. That impacts both how we approach research prioritization as well as the type of projects we fund. Next slide. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we engage with a variety of partners to gather future research priorities that can be incorporated into the 5-year plan. For the public process, we have an online comment and concept collection survey where the public can submit research ideas. We also hosted 2 public meetings to understand existing or emerging research needs. We will have a public docket associated with the board hearing as well. We also consult with public agencies, our research screening committee, board members, and academic partners. As I mentioned, this year we incorporated a community-based organization process that included virtual meetings with 7 CBO partners and 7 community meetings, with 6 of those being in-person regional meetings. And I'll discuss that more later today. We also met with EJAC co-chairs in March, and all of this informs future research priorities, which we integrate into the 5-year plan, which will guide our funding of future research projects. Next slide. This just outlines the 7 CBOs that we worked with: Breeze, Southern California, Orange County Environmental Justice, United for Justice, Alianza, Central California Asthma Collaborative, Benicia Community Air Monitoring Air Program, and Climate Resilient Communities. Next slide. So CARB wanted to ensure that we reached a variety of environmental justice organizations throughout the state and compensated the individuals for the level of work necessary to gather meaningful input. The CBOs were selected through an open online solicitation focused on CBO and tribes that work in priority communities, have environmental justice research experience with working with some form of government, and who could provide regional diversity. We reviewed applicants through a rigorous internal process and developed service contracts with the 7 selected CBOs, running from April of 2024 through the end of March 2025. The total compensation is between $5,000 and $8,500 per contract, depending on if the CBO hosted a public meeting with us or not. Next slide. The work with CBOs was an iterative process. We started with an outline of environmental justice research ideas we compiled from existing public processes, research we're doing with communities, CARB priorities, and other venues. That was a list of 22 ideas. We worked with the CBOs through 3 rounds of written and verbal feedback to span the list and prioritize. In the first 2 rounds, CBOs expanded on 12 of the existing ideas, added 15 new ideas, and prioritized the list of 37. We then co-hosted 7 public roundtables focused on environmental justice research. Outcomes from those meetings expanded 14 of the existing ideas and added 1 new one. During these meetings, we asked community members to prioritize broad ideas they generated. CARB staff took the list of 38, combined some, reworded some, and removed some because we had existing research or was outside of CARB's authority or current programmatic priorities. From that process, we ended up with 26. The CBOs then provided written and verbal feedback and prioritized the top 2 per theme, and ranked the overall top 10 in terms of urgency. And by urgency, we mean what research should happen first. We took that list and incorporated it into the future research priorities, which includes other research that has emerged during our internal and external processes. And we're currently finalizing those sections. Next slide. Just quickly on the roundtables, we met with approximately 180 attendees. Generally, the attendance included local residents and local CBOs or NGOs. Next slide. In terms of process, the roundtables were 90 minutes long, with 70 minutes spent asking community members to share research ideas or concerns, and then prioritize those as a group. The 6 roundtables were led in English with Spanish translation, and 1 was in Spanish with English translation. Each roundtable had at least 1 breakout group in Spanish. Next slide. For the next 5 slides, I'll cover the 26 themes that emerged. These are listed from top to bottom priority for each theme, and we've also listed 1 through 10 using number icons to indicate how CBOs prioritize the timeliness of their top 10. So for air quality, the 6 future research priorities include a research on the impacts of air quality interactions with climate change. We also heard requests for research on equitable monitoring and reducing local disparities, questions on the distribution of local pollutant sources, understanding the future drivers of PM 2.5, assessing the impacts of climate on PM 2.5 and ozone in EJ communities, And lastly, agricultural impacts on rural communities. These are very top-line research needs. The 5-year plan will include more detail, and we have the feedback from CBOs and the roundtables that provide more specific concerns and ideas. For climate requests, next slide. For climate requests, we heard 4 main topics. First, what are equity impacts of climate mitigation? Second, what is the distribution and effectiveness of co-benefits of climate and air quality funding? Third, what are the impacts of wildfires on the environment and health with the focus on how burn scars impact air quality? And lastly, what are impacts of climate-driven wildfire emissions and methods to reduce exposure? Next slide. There were 3 main needs related to mobile sources. First, what are the most effective ways to measure and reduce high emitters in priority communities? Second, how can we use remote sensing to understand and address emission disparities? And this includes warehousing and heavy-duty traffic. Lastly, there were requests for research on the real-world impacts from brake and tire wear. Next slide. 3 main ideas were prioritized on sustainable communities. Those include questions about the physical, mental, and economic benefits of public transit and walkable, bikeable, and accessible cities. Also, what type of communication increases climate and air quality awareness and improves public responses to heat waves, air quality, and wildfires? And finally, how do we incentivize car-free zones? Next slide. The last area I'll cover was a major area of focus, which was health impacts research. From that, 6 major themes emerged. First, what are short, long, and generational health risks from climate change and multi-pollutant exposure? Second, requests on understanding the health impacts from extreme weather events, heat, flood, and droughts. Third, the long-term health impacts from wildfires in addition to air pollution. Fourth, what toxics are impacting indoor and outdoor air quality, and what must be prioritized to protect health? Fifth, what are the acute and chronic health impacts from the Salton Sea? And lastly, how do we monitor trends in air pollution and health at finer community scales? Next slide. For the people who participated in this process, there are 4 major follow-ups. First, we will generate appendices for the plan that list all of the research ideas that were generated from the CBOs, roundtables, and public meetings. Second, we will provide annual updates on what was funded from this process and what the outcomes were. Third, the research program committed to funding at least 1 project from the CBO process per year on average. Lastly, we are developing processes to continue community engagement in developing these projects. Next slide. The next steps for the 5-year plan are to finalize the research priorities and release a draft plan for comment. Next slide. We wanted to pause here to see if you have any questions, and on the next slide, we just have some basic discussion questions. And with that, I will turn it for questions.
All right, we'll open up to the committee for questions and comments on the presentation.
I put my hand up.
Go ahead, sorry.
And I've said this before, and I'll say it again now that we're in a public meeting. I would hope when this happens again that you go to the EJAC first to help you develop the RFP, help you identify folks, because this kind of happened and we found out about it on the tail end. We missed the RFP process. And frankly, as a person from LA, I was very unhappy with the process. So you have all of these folks on this call who are environmental justice experts who have deep networks in many different communities, including, we're all networked. And it seemed just a waste of a really important resource. And you might have done this thing differently. And for me, the way this process worked, I mistrust the results. And so it just saddened me that this is how this was done.
Thank you. Going next to Jill and then Kevin. Jill, did you have your hand up?
Oh, sorry, I'm talking and I'm not off.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm like, how did I miss this happening? Like, did I miss an email? How did EJAC not know that this was happening? Because when I looked at the short list that you had of CBOs, and I don't know if we can get a complete list of the CBOs that you engaged with, I don't feel like the organizations were necessarily, environmental justice organizations or people who work in those spaces. So that's concerning to me. I just recently learned that CARB is working on a tribal engagement process using a university, and instead of actually trying to engage the tribes individually. And that saddened me. That I guess the only caveat is the researcher from Berkeley is an enrolled tribal member. But I just feel like, how could EJEC not know about these processes? And I have to echo Martadina's comments that it would seem like you would want to work with the EJAC to help you develop the RFP, and find, and maybe even identify some organizations for these meetings to be hosted, especially in tribal spaces, I'll say, just because tribes are governments just like the state is. And I don't know, I'm just a little thrown off by this. So that's my comment.
Thank you. I saw Kevin's hand and also Chanel.
So, yes, there are a number of us on that list, CCAC included, who are on that list. I personally am willing to take some of the ownership for not bringing this to the EJAC. Again, if you go through that list, you'll find quite a number of the organizations are EJAC members. I think we get so caught up in our own work, CCAC and Luis's group in South Eastern California, and Naimeen's group, CCEJN. We have been working diligently for the past almost 10 years now to build a community-based, community-owned air monitoring network with a warning system for residents that's focusing on climate disaster and air pollution danger. And I think we've been so caught up in that work when we heard about this opportunity to build this this project, being sort of the mad scientists we are in a way, we jumped right on it. I have no excuse for not bringing that to EJAC at that point, along with my colleagues. Some of our group was asked to join the research committee to look at potential research projects for this coming 3-year period, I guess it is. And of course, we jumped at that opportunity as well, because so often we are excluded from that. I think it's going to take time to get used to having and using this resource in that arena, and being more responsible to do that. I think that change also has to come. While I'm willing to own our piece of it, even though I've now, as is well known, pretty much retired from CCAC after founding it and with my colleague Tim Tyner and working to build it for so many years, and this asset along with it, which was just a gift to be able to create this, and so many residents are benefiting from it across most of the state. And we know that there's a lot more that needs to be done, and we are builders as well. And so they're working with, I don't know how many communities now. I think there's 9, and there'll be more. There's going to be close to 30 of them, so that they each have access to their own local monitoring network and not rely on only on regional level air monitoring to decide even if they want to take their kids outside and play that day, which is still a damn shame that we have to do that. So again, my apologies. I don't know what else to say other than, I don't know if any of my colleagues have anything to say regarding that issue. Again, process. I think when the flag goes up and there's a request by the research division, which, by the way, 10 years ago would not even have reached out to folks like us to see if we wanted to play. So I have to go to the other side and say, that they at least are trying to change. And I think listening to us today, I expect that there will be even more of that, and that in this next round, they will certainly be reaching out to the EJAC and others who may not have the benefit of EJAC to participate in that process, because it is an open process and it's always published on CARB's website. But if you're not hooked into that particular link, you won't get those emails. So I think having those emails come to EJAC and be announced at EJAC as being available, and then EJAC taking some responsibility to get them out to their communities and start that domino effect is definitely something we can take up here as part of our work in this coming year.
Thank you, Kevin. Noting I've got a couple hands raised, so we'll go in the order that the hands are raised. We've got Chanel, then we'll go to Luis, and then Dr. Catherine, and then Matt.
So thank you. This has been really helpful. I just want to reflect kind of like on three things. So one, I wanted to kind of go back to what Dr. Catherine had said around kind of the priorities and the places where CARB and the EJAC can work together. I think so part of what we're doing here in part is starting to bring things to the EJAC, right? So I think I think the priorities presentation, a lot of it is, so it's like, hey, here are our priorities. What are things that we can work on together? So I think a lot of this is really meant for exactly what's happening right now, is like a dialogue and a conversation for us to have. And I think we don't want it to be a top-down process where we're like, here's all the things that we can do. We really do want to engage in that. And so I think that this is already happening as a part of this process. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think the second thing, and I want to kind of tee off of what you were sharing, Kevin, because what I appreciated about it was kind of like, one, I think we are trying to make that change. We are trying to shift what we are doing. The team that kind of pulled this together, I think, really did try to reach out to a number of folks. I know on our end, for my team, we did send out multiple emails to the EJAC about this process, like, hey, this is coming up. Hey, this is happening. I liked what you said, Kevin, about like maybe it's also an announcement in an EJAC meeting as well. And that makes sense to me. I think we're happy to do that and take that feedback in. But I do want to acknowledge that this is a shift. Like if you look how we did, I think, previous plans, like the idea of doing this and doing this kind of like work, and all of this is on our website where you can link and you can kind of see the matrices and that transparency. That is a big shift for us and our team. I'm not saying it's completely right, but I think we are trying to do some of this work. We are trying to outreach. And like I said, I know we did send multiple emails to the EJAC. So it's helpful to hear feedback of like, in addition to those emails, maybe it's announcements. And I will acknowledge that I think for Martha Dina, she and I have had conversations about this, and I appreciate that. And so I think that feels consistent. But I did just want to note, like, it's helpful to kind of hear, in addition to maybe like sending the emails, in addition to the listservs, what are other things and resources that we can do to make sure that we're really, I think, tapping into this. I think as you put it, Martha Dina, right, there's a network of people here. So I did want to kind of just make sure that it was clear in terms of like, it is a change in how we're doing things. I think the team is putting in a lot of work to make those changes. We are trying to reach broader than where we've gone before. And I think we do always appreciate and want that kind of constructive feedback.
Thank you. We'll go to Luis, then Dr. Catherine, and then Matt.
How close I have to hold it? Is that good? Oh, real close? Okay. Yeah. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for your leadership in the research division. I, of course, go back to like before 2017, where we made the strategies of the research division a high priority for our community. And I know that also received a lot of attention at a statewide level from environmental justice advocates, because the research division at one point was pulling research priorities out of a magician's hat. And with your leadership in CARB, and I'm sure many others involved, has really come a long way. This is not at all what it used to be. So I want to thank you and your team and everyone else involved that made this happen. I know it was often brought to the board, and I appreciate their proactiveness in changing the way CARB prioritizes research. And at that time, it was, we need research that helps solve problems and helps improve the quality of life in disadvantaged environmental justice communities, and helps us get answers and identify solutions. And I believe that that's what the research division is doing today. And I'm looking this way. I don't even know where the camera's at. So I'm looking at you here, but I'm sure you're over here too. So, but I did want to point out one thing. CARB did make an investment in which San Diego State University did, in collaboration with Comité Cívico, did a comprehensive work. I didn't see it recognized. I imagine, I understand there was a special exercise, but one of the things we would not like to see is that comprehensive investment, the mass outreach that happened with that to help inform the research. And I didn't see it on the map. I didn't see it acknowledged or recognized. And I understand that that is perhaps a different exercise, but how is that integrated in this? Because I just don't see it recognized. And of course, as a matter of efficiency and non-duplication, is there, how can I identify it within informing this plan?
I appreciate that, Luis. So it's not called out specifically in here. These are kind of broad priorities moving forward. I think some of the, and I appreciate all the work that was done in that research roadmap that we did in Imperial Valley. And within that, some of the questions that are being asked probably fall across multiple of our research priorities. And we'll definitely be taking what came out of that process and looking at where it fits within that, and maybe seeing what we can prioritize and move forward in the future.
Do you understand that it will be prioritized in the future?
We will look at, I have not seen what questions have been finalized from that process, but I know there was a lot of engagement and questions for future research that were developed in there, and we will be considering those for future research priorities. We have a whole process we have to go through every year, but we definitely respect what came out of that process, and we'll look at that specifically in future research prioritization.
And Elizabeth, I've had an extraordinary experience, conversations with you, with your team, and your proactiveness on many fronts. And the reason I'm expressing so much appreciation is because it's not easy to find somebody who's in research and be so community focused as you are. That's a hard and rare experience trait to find, and I appreciate you for that. I also know that there's many influences as to what directs a leader like yourself, and what they may tell you that is a pathway to assessing our community. I'm going to have to say that it did feel far short. I think you have a really keen sense of how to approach our communities. So I highly encourage you, and if you need my help, I'm happy to step in as well to help support you in your leadership, because I do feel that you can do this within your own leadership, and I appreciate the leadership of the board, the leadership of the executive officer, but I do feel that I feel that this was very limiting in the Imperial Valley, and I don't believe that is in alignment with what you have demonstrated in your experience, and I look forward to continue working with you directly on that to fill those gaps. I do have one more question. I don't know if you had a follow-up to that, but if you don't, I did have one more question.
I was just going to say I'm happy to work with you to work through any concerns you might have or have some further conversations on it.
And the other thing I wanted to point out is I don't see, whether they are wildfires as we've seen, throughout California year after year. Obviously, these are natural disasters or unnatural, depending on how they initiate. There's just so much misinformation and deliberate misinformation of, the way that these situations happen in California. Very unfortunate because, without getting into details, very divisive. But we in California treat these as disasters, and we want to prevent them any way that we can. And my heart goes out to all those who lost their homes, lost their livelihood, and some from CARB were affected. And it just breaks my heart to see that happen. But we also have situations where wildfires can also be characterized as those that are permitted within our communities to occur. Whether we call them control burns, prescribed burns, they are happening, and they're happening with intensity. Those may be policy, those may be regulatory enforcement. I believe CARB can do more. And I know that we're talking research versus other areas of work of CARB, but I do want to use this platform to elevate that the climate crisis is not those things that we can control, but it's as we've seen in California through regulations and regulating industries and rationing down on these impacts on our climate at a local and global scale. We can do more to also deter burning from happening, whether it's prescribed or controlled, because we've seen far too many times these prescribed and controlled burns being the culprit to wildfires, right? And wildfires doesn't mean that they have to spread over hundreds of acres of land, but they can also happen with piles of forage type of commodities that often we're told they burn more efficiently. We just let them smolder and burn over the next 2-3 weeks, right? And those have a heavy impact on our health, on our community, on our climate, on our ability to meet the federal and state regulations or Clean Air Act. So I also wanted to see, there's something that I didn't see here on. It probably fits in various areas, but I was looking at climate research needs, and there's obviously I'm pretty sure that scenario it can fit in various areas of your research. Again, I'm going beyond the research, but again, I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Noting that we did have Matt with his hand raised. He has put his hand down. He's going to follow up offline. So I will go to Dr. Catherine.
Thank you. I have 2 comments and 2 interrelated questions. I think first, just layering off the first point that Luis was making, I'm not clear if it's a separate process, but what I'm also hearing is a need to summarize and reflect on what the outcomes were from the previous research plan and the previous round of research, both broadly and also specifically what it meant in terms of environmental justice research. My other comment is recognizing that this is what I would describe as an input process of giving feedback on ideas, and potentially being able to move research forward, gesundheit. And there is also the output process of what research actually gets selected. So I believe it was maybe 2 years ago now that there was a call put out, particularly for people who have a background in working on environmental justice and working with communities, for what I believe is called the Research Screening Committee at the Air Resources Board. So not only have I served on EJAC for 4 years now, I have a PhD in geography. I've done community-based participatory action research, and I've worked with, we're at CVAC for 20 years now. So I did apply at that time. I don't think I ever actually officially heard back, but my understanding is that because I'm on EJAC, somehow now I can't be on the research screening committee, and that to me is a gap. That's a problem, right? Like, I have a pretty unique expertise that I could bring to help ensure that environmental justice priorities aren't just a part of the input process, but also can be prioritized in how they're selected. Because frankly, if you have a lot of researchers that are more heavily focused in hard science, which we've talked before, that really is a bias at CARB, then potentially things like community-based participatory action research and taking a multidisciplinary approach that includes social sciences falls through the cracks. And I think that that's an ongoing gap that I'd really like to see addressed. So it doesn't necessarily need to be me, but just sharing my personal experience as a lens into there are not that many people that do research and approach academia and advocacy in the way that I do. So I would like to see more people like that be on the research screening committee. Then in terms of my questions, the slides talked about 22 research needs, and it also came under the title of environmental justice research. I was not clear if it was 22 research needs total, like globally, or specific to environmental justice. Some of the topics even mentioned on the list were more general, which again, obviously CARB should do general research, but that leads to my second question, which is I basically am trying to clarify, how is environmental justice actually being operationalized within research at CARB? Because there is a difference between researching impacts on environmental justice communities and doing generalized research about climate and air pollution impacts.
And I can answer that. So these 22 topic areas, they are going into, these were high level to kind of summarize for you. There will be more detail in the plan itself, and the plan will be larger than these 20 some topics that we talked about today. And that will kind of guide future areas that we look at. Each year, we select projects within that are guided by the 5-year plan. And those also go through a public process and are prioritized. And we look for public input during that process. Also, when we're developing the concepts and the statements of work, we have started applying a racial equity lens to that has been modified for research purposes to make sure that aspect comes into the research that we're doing. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm seeing Tom with his hand up and also Ray. We'll go to Tom.
Yeah, just quickly to offer information if it's useful. I'm not necessarily complaining about the outreach. I just wanted to provide information. Somebody said that there was like multiple emails that went out to EJAC. I did know about this process. I didn't have time capacity to be involved. But I was just, double checking. It looks like I did receive one email that was sent out to the whole EJAC about the process. I don't see any other ones. This was back in July. I do have one other email about it, which was forwarded to me from another environmental justice advocate who their email is like them being invited directly to the workshops that were going on near them. So again, this isn't necessarily just to complain about the process, but to add information. So if you're looking at like, oh, how was outreach done? How could it be done better? I'm just saying that's the outreach that I received. The other comment that I just wanted to make was I see that under the climate research needs, the mention about equity impacts on climate mitigation, impacts of green hydrogen and biofuels on priority communities. I just want to say again, as I've said many times at these meetings, that we are seeing a big push, lots of money, tens of millions of dollars invested in making the northern San Joaquin Valley a bio-industrial hub to make biofuels. So I'm just wondering what the opportunities will be when this research is being done to utilize what's going on in the northern San Joaquin Valley. And I'm sure myself and Valley Improvement Projects would be happy to be involved with CARB on that research. We're really a lot of these solutions are being touted as climate solutions that are going to benefit the community, but some of them are literally, they are adding pollution not only from the stationary source, but from up to 100 diesel trucks being added to the roads and trains being added to bring in and out these fuels. So just wanted to remind folks of that, of what's going on in the northern San Joaquin Valley. And I just wanted to point out that I think it relates to under air quality research, the agricultural impacts on rural communities, including pesticides and dairies. One of the points we've been really trying to make around this whole ag waste industry to biofuels and biogases is that we are without, I guess, demanding more sustainable practices in agriculture, we're allowing the same old things to go along with, with pesticides, overuse of water, dairies and things like that. But we're adding a new revenue source for some of these operations. And so that will actually promote and allow the same unsustainable practices to continue. So I'm hoping that is part of the research and not only the direct effects, but kind of this ripple effect that goes on when you're utilizing ag waste, creating that new revenue stream for the ag industry that's going to continue the same practices. Thank you.
Thank you. Going to Ray.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I don't recall anything about that research, but what I do recall is a number of years back while on EJAC, I believe it was documented that now I'm a big fan of gray water systems, and I mentioned it in terms of how it could be a benefit for GHG redux, and of course, in the benefit will have impacts in other areas. And when I talk about environmental justice, air quality is part of it, climate, of course, but it's also water quality and it's economic justice. Of course, CARB is it's about the air resources, but I think what we promote, advance, and establish that ultimately becomes regulation or influences policy. It has impacts beyond air quality, and so for me, the reason why back in those days I was promoting gray water is because at the end of the day, it's going to be all about greenhouse gases and air quality. Of course, it's going to have an impact also in terms of water quantity for communities, because especially those of our communities on the west side, like in Huron, that are in the drought-stricken areas, when we are imposed a 25% allocation, meaning we can only use 25% of the water that we are allocated because of the drought. it has a huge impact. The last time it happened on us, we lost about 100 trees in our small community. And so one of the first things that we did early on, right after I became mayor, actually, is establish an ordinance for gray water systems, meaning all new homes will have a gray water ready setup, and all apartment complexes will have a full-fledged gray water system. You know, what that means is that, I mean, if you have a gray water system, that means you're not using potable water for your trees. And when the 25% allocation hits, it makes it illegal to water your trees. It makes it illegal to wash your cars. Makes a few things illegal. And but if you have a gray water system, your trees stay alive. They continue capturing carbon. They continue providing shade, cooling your yard, cooling the community, reducing the need to have your air conditioner on as much. And it also reduces the need to have so much water pumped because of the demand lessens, to whatever extent, and that represents GHG redux, right? Of course, it also represents saving to the families in the in terms of finance. It's just all around. It's very positive. So a long time ago, I said, "Well, let's get some research here to find out if we switched over 1 million homes or however many homes that are in regions where they can go gray water, what would that look like in terms of GHG redux, right? What would be the economic impact, positive impact? What would be the necessary investments? Similar to back in the days when we had a program to encourage homeowners to change their lawns to drought resilient lawn or yards. There was money that helped families to incentivize it. And then there was also a bunch of trainings at the time. I think it was as they were called then, the local government commission was doing trainings on gray water, was doing trainings on irrigation efficiency, which was good because there was folks from agencies that were taking those trainings so that they could be more impactful in putting in infrastructure that used less water. And and so I mean, today, fast forward, I have, we didn't pursue it. That research never happened. We don't have a stronger grasp of it. But I think it's a real solution in terms of saving water, saving clean air, and saving money and creating jobs. We've been kind of just moving forward with it in my area. And actually, the Leap Institute got a grant from, we're a subgrantee from Department of Conservation. And so anyways, we'll be training displaced farm workers on gray water systems installation. So for me, it's kind of, I think we could do this at a way larger scale if we could do some of our part as CARB to do the research. If CARB could do the research to get some numbers and have a better understanding, because it's a real solution. It's a real solution for economic, environmental, and climate justice. But anyways, I just wanted to share that because that's been my experience. And if we're talking research, I think we still need to research gray water and what that means and what that could mean, and how it will save many things in many ways. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'll turn it to Chanel. I think we're going to wrap this item up.
Sure. And can we go back a slide? I don't know who's still controlling the slide deck. One more. This one right here. This has been a really great conversation, and I think it's been really helpful to get this kind of feedback. I think both for Elizabeth, for you, and I know members of your team are on. I just wanted to flag draft plan is March 2025. The final plan and the annual projects is summer of 2025. I think one of the things that we can do is and I kind of hear this feedback, right, is like, hey, I didn't get any emails. I think part of the challenge is that we do kind of put them in informational updates and it's buried in other information. So I feel like I hear loud and clear the need of like let's do more announcements and call it out in the meetings or a separate email on some things like this. I think also, Elizabeth, we can circle with you because maybe it makes sense to come back to the EJAC and get some more input, right? Like maybe after the draft plans, we can circle on that front because I feel like there was a lot of good ideas that were discussed. But I do just want to say that, like, I think this was like, at least in my opinion, like a really great conversation, really helpful feedback. And I wanted to make sure that folks kind of knew the next steps in terms of the plan, as well as on our end, just in terms of how we communicate this information out, some of the things that we can just shift and change in our own end. And finally, I think some of the substantive points that were brought up, like I think, Ray was talking about like the gray water, right? Tommy, you were talking about a number of different efforts in Luis. I think those are things that we can definitely, I think, also you can circle directly with research, but also on our end, we can make sure that we're kind of bringing this topic back to the group again after we circle with you, Elizabeth, and your team.
Great. And I did just want to note, I apologize. The draft plan is actually May. That was something that we should have corrected. Apologies. But yes, thank you, Shana.
Thank you. I think that takes us to our next agenda item, which is agenda item number 8B, methane satellite data community engagement efforts. I will turn it back over to Carb.
Great. And you get to listen to me again for this presentation. So thank you. All right. Good afternoon. I will be talking to you in this presentation about the California Satellite Methane Project and upcoming community engagement opportunities. Next slide. First, let's begin with just some background on the California Satellite Methane Monitoring Project. So there's a strong interest in reducing methane emissions since it is a powerful greenhouse gas and the second largest contributor to climate change after carbon dioxide. While methane itself does not present acute health effects, we recognize its presence raises important questions about what co-pollutants might be present. Because of this and its climate impacts, that's why we're taking steps to address plumes and make sure communities are informed. Over the last decade, CARB and its partners have demonstrated the use of remote sensing technology to detect methane emissions and support action to mitigate those emissions. Over the last 10 years and 4 airborne campaigns, methane plume detection was proven to be effective when used on airplanes. So CARB is now planning to purchase methane plume data through a commercial satellite platform to be selected by a competitive bidding process. This will allow more frequent data collection and broader coverage of California. Our primary goal for this data is to use the satellite data to support mitigation, enforce regulations, and protect public health. I want to note that CARB has included provisions for satellite remote sensing data in the oil and gas regulation and is considering similar provisions in upcoming landfill methane regulation amendments. On the right of this slide, you will see some example images of plumes detected during our recent airborne campaigns. Note that these plumes were observed by aircraft at a lower altitude than the satellites, but with a similar instrument that will be used on the satellites. Next slide. As part of the funding allocated by the California state budget for purchasing satellite data, $5 million was provided in the state budget to support engagement with communities related to the upcoming satellite methane project. Several members here had previously contributed to a letter sent by CBOs to CARB, emphasizing the importance of funding for community engagement efforts related to the satellite methane observations and ensuring community access to this data. A competitive grant solicitation will be released by CARB in the coming months in order to begin the process of distributing this grant funding. The goal is to fund community outreach efforts to ensure these data are accessible, understandable, and useful to communities. We're currently anticipating the grant may be managed by a third-party administrator that will award subgrants to and oversee CBOs in developing and implementing community engagement plan. It'll help CARB develop protocols and mechanisms to inform communities when plumes are found and provide training and assistance for communities on interpreting the methane plume observational data. This is a draft and we are seeking input. Next slide. To that note, CARB is planning a virtual public meeting to gather input on the upcoming community engagement grant solicitation. This meeting will cover the process and key goals for the solicitation. It's tentatively planned for late March. Some topics that will be discussed include background information on the project, a summary of the proposed grant solicitation process and proposed scope of the grant, and will solicit feedback by asking questions on the specific topics and goals related to the grant. We can also make ourselves available to meet with individual CBOs upon request after the workshop. Next slide. So thank you for your time today. We welcome your participation in the upcoming meeting. And if you have any questions or comments, we have some time now and we are available through the following contact information.
Thank you. Opening up to the committee for discussion, starting with Dr. Catherine.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that presentation. Central Valley Air Quality Coalition was one of the groups that organized around this proposal when it first came out in the budget. One of the core points that we were making is that we know where the methane leaks are coming from, and there tends to be a focus on data gathering and collection. So while it is true that we asked to prioritize community engagement, we also asked for a focus on enforcement. Because this is a lot of money that groups on the ground are already doing enforcement in their communities with very little resources, essentially doing the job of the state and the local air district in finding where these leaks are. So just recently, we got reports from partner organizations of 7 methane super leaks happening in the San Joaquin Valley. And the Sierra Club put out a report showing that there are more than 50,000 wells in Kern County alone that are leaking methane. We already know where a lot of these emissions are coming from. And years ago, when this was a budget proposal, we advocated for some of the money for the satellites to go to those community-based organizations. Many of us had multiple conversations and submitted multiple letters. So for the record, I did just also want to name some of the priorities that we collectively came up with for this funding. The first being that agencies' enforcement activities should be integrated, because we recognize that due to complex rules, the Air Resources Board, CalGIM, air districts, and other relevant entities like local governments each at times have a different role in addressing leaks, which at times can be critical for people living nearby. So integrated, expeditious, proactive, and community engaged. And then we had a whole lot of subpoints that I won't read here about what community engaged meant. We also asked number 2 that data and data practices must remain open source and in the public domain, not restricted by assertions of proprietary privilege by private partners. If we're going to spend a bunch of money collecting data, we need to ensure that it's public data. We also asked number 3 to prioritize the identification of California methane emission sources from individual large emission plumes and or sources with a history of violations that may have a disproportionate contribution to regional emissions and methane hotspots. And number 4, require CARB's methane satellite program to solicit input and integrate recommendations from bodies like the AB 617 consultation group and the EJAC. So glad that you're here today having this conversation. And more broadly, also just want to note that an ask was to reform the Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Administrative Fund and the Hazardous and Idle and Deserted Well Abatement Fund to allow for increased collection and expenditure of operator assessment and idle well fees for oil capping remediation. We've found a lot of times in communities like Kern County, when the information is available about who owns it, sometimes they've gone bankrupt, sometimes ownership has switched multiple times, sometimes that delays those leaks actually being plugged and repaired, and sometimes it's not always just methane that's leaking. We need to prioritize protecting local communities and their health and streamline ways of making sure that those leaks are addressed when they're found.
Thank you. We'll go to Matt. You've got your hand raised.
Yeah, Catherine covered it perfectly. The only thing that I would underscore is, when it says that methane isn't necessarily an acute pollutant, it's hanging out with a bunch of people when it's leaking out of a wellhead. So there's really an urgent health protective need for that information, especially the satellite data, to get to communities immediately We can't allow this data to go AQ view and end up somewhere where nobody uses it. It needs to be transferred immediately to community-based organizations who are the only people that are going to call their county commissioner, their hazmat ombudsman. Going to a program officer at the CARB is essentially rendering this is a postmortem as opposed to an intervention opportunity. And there's no reason that you can't target this to organizations that are already working on these issues in these areas. It's really a disproportionate burden with these wellheads. And excited to say that the technology is able to spot all sorts of methane leakage, also from landfills and even from wetlands during certain times. So it's a very useful tool that CARB. This is the one where you should be able to find a way to get around this concept of competitive equity. Like if CCEJN has to fill out an application to help CARB with the fact that it's failed this community with equal protection under the law for 35 years. That's just a whole additional burden to reach, status quo. You can target this, and if people give you a hard time, I'll back you up.
Thank you. We'll go to Luis and then Kevin Hamilton.
So both Catherine and Matt had already spoken much of what I wanted to say, so I just want to reinforce the comments that have already been made, the priorities that have already been raised. Again, Elizabeth, I want to thank you for your proactiveness. It's been a bit of a frustration not really knowing where the commitment that was made to environmental justice on the original proposal that was brought to the legislature, and the fact that a $10 million commitment turned into a $5 million. And so given that there is this dedicated funding, I do want to thank you again for proactively reaching out and planning ahead on making sure that some of these shortfalls that were part of the proposal that didn't highlight, again, I don't want to go through the whole list, but enforcement being an important one, more comprehensive engagement, being able to use the data and resulting in actions, whether it be policy, enforcement, or deploying the already existing capacities of the air board, or even at the local level, even at the federal level, whatever jurisdiction can respond to data. For a long time, we have seen that research has evolved from at one point the better plan, which was community engaged, to research to action, which I feel it's a better plan, right? I feel this is the opportunity to research to action, right? The other part is there's also another simultaneous effort that is happening where a significant amount of investment went into mobile monitoring that is also trying to track the same type of pollutants on the ground level. I am a little concerned that the priorities that have been identified are only those communities that have been nominated. And that's might be a way that CARB can say, well, we're not ignoring you, nominated communities. And that is important. I mean, the better outcome would be that all communities that have been identified having to deal with the burden of living in conditions that violate the laws that are there to protect them. But it's important to also assure that these resources are being deployed where they're needed, right? To be able to both get on the ground and the data from above the ground, and being able to zero in, track, and do something about these sources that are impacting our climate, impacting our atmosphere, and also have an impact on the ground. So I look forward to continued dialogue and continued discussion here at the Environmental Justice Advisory. I highly encourage that this is a frequent revisit at every meeting until this gets on the ground and put into practice or deployed. Yeah, that's all I have for the moment.
Thank you. Going to Kevin Hamilton.
So I'm really excited about the satellite methane project. I have to tell you what we really need to see here is correlation between what the satellite is showing us and what we're measuring on the ground, and that's the critical piece, right? So we've got Lawrence Berkeley National Labs has been working with us with Sebastian Berod and his team now on summation since 2017. We've been in Kern County with monitors on the ground, mobile monitoring. We've pretty much mapped the whole city of Bakersfield at this point with mobile devices. And in doing that, we have uncovered a number of leaks that are PG&E leaks rather than wells. We've also got a number of wells, but the PG&E leaks have been remarkable as well. So not just focusing on wells, but the infrastructure that's moving this gas into neighborhoods. One of the examples was a gentleman who had a few acres outside of town there in Arvin was finding that he was planting some trees and they kept dying every year. And so 4 or 5 years in 3 different plantings, our mobile comes by and finds, wow, the concentration on the street out front was so high, we were stunned. And so indeed, there was a leak under his land. It was leaking into his water system. And of course, turning into, methane always wants to be somebody else, turning into something that was killing his trees. Fixed the leak, trees are now growing. So there's more impacts here other than just the direct health impacts. There's still homes in Kern that have had leaks in their neighborhoods, and the solution has been to put in a ventilation system and a sensor that starts a pump and a fan that pulls air out of the house and out through a pipe and up above the roof if it senses a leak. And this is how ridiculous it's gotten down there. So we need good technology. We need to be able to correlate the leaks that we know are there, that are being measured. CCEJN has, I don't know how many feet of FLIR camera rolls now of active leaks that are occurring on the ground. So again, we need to see that this data, this information is going to be publicly available. And what's CARB going to do when it finds these leaks? Now, I won't argue that methane is not toxic in and of itself, but it will replace the oxygen in the room eventually if it concentrates enough, and you will die. So through suffocation, basically. So, this is not a joke. I laugh, but it is not funny at all. We now have another project going on that happily got funded as part of some federal money, assuming that it still comes, on the Get Bus program in Kern, where I think we probably have the only methane sensor riding around on a bus in Kern County that is collecting information as it moves and identifying that East Bakersfield and Kern in the basin there has got a lot of locations that are experiencing high levels of methane. And the research team can certainly reach out to Sebastian, or we can connect you to that team. And it's Riverside, it's 5 universities. And also we've had some satellite time, and we've had some fixed wing aircraft time. So we've talked about that a lot. Publications are out there. This project's coming in. We need to see the 2 link. There's funding now for another, I think, 3 to 5 years for that group to keep working down there in Kern. So we need that kind of collaboration.
Thank you. Looking to any additional discussion from the committee. We have seamlessly moved into the next agenda item, which was EJAC questions on the CARB presentations. We have been having that conversation as we go. So that is the agenda item that we are on at this point. I will pause to see if there's additional comments or discussion. As mentioned before, we do have a packed agenda today, so it might be time for a break, I believe. Oh, go ahead.
Before we go to break, I saw Elizabeth, you came off of mute and you just gave us two different presentations. So again, want to express gratitude for that and see if you had any closing comments before we go to break.
I just want to thank everybody for their input and to just remind folks we will be sending out a listserv after this workshop or after this meeting on the solicitation workshop, and really hope that you all can attend and provide your input on the grant solicitations, and we can provide feedback or updates to the EJAC on how this goes.
Thank you. I think that concludes this item. We will take a 15-minute break and be back at 3:01. Thank you. All right, the time is now 3:01. We will now reconvene and take a moment just to do roll call, make sure we're still at quorum. I'll give everybody a moment to rejoin. And for this roll call, you can just verbally state present or here. We'll start with Martha Dina Arguello.
Marta Dina Arguello is present.
Thank you. Juan Flores. Dr. Catherine Grupa.
Here in the room.
Kevin Hamilton. Yeah, I see Kevin virtually online. We'll give him a moment. We'll see if he rejoins us. John Harriel Jr. Tom Helm.
I am here online.
Thank you. Matt Holmes.
Present.
Thank you. John Keppen Jefferson III. Ray Leone. We'll give Ray a moment. I know people are coming back from the break right now. Luis Almedo.
Luis Olmedo, Executive Director, Comité Cívico.
Thank you. Jill Sherman Warren.
Present.
Thank you. All right, we'll go back to, we have Kevin Hamilton with us. Great, I think you stepped away for a moment. And Ray Leone. Okay, and we do note we've got Juan rejoining in just a moment. Okay, we'll go ahead and continue the meeting. We'll take it now to CARB's presentation on their 2025 priorities.
Thanks, Jane. Is the slide up? Slide deck up?
We're pulling it up, Chanel, just now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jane, and everyone. So just want to acknowledge that, so Dr. Cliff, our executive officer, he delivered these 2025 priorities at the January 23rd board meeting. So for those who weren't able to attend that board meeting, I did want to kind of share our priorities. As I mentioned before, part of this is really, I think, on our end, wanting to make sure that the EJAC is aware, but also we want to hear feedback on places where the EJAC and CARB can collaborate and can work together on. So wanted to make sure that we have this conversation and share these priorities with the EJAC directly and walk through them. I also wanted to just note that, as we've already seen, 2025 is going to bring some challenges as CARB continues to drive progress towards fulfilling its mission. I will start by addressing those two specific areas of challenge head on. So one is going to be the change in the federal administration, and the second one is going to be the impact of our budget challenges. So next slide. The new federal administration has stated its intention to continue its efforts to roll back our programs and our authorities, which are designed to protect public health and the climate. So in light of this, CARB withdrew the remaining requests before US EPA for the waivers and authorizations to enforce some of our key transportation regulations. While we were disappointed that the previous US EPA was unable to act on all of those requests before them, we also knew that keeping those pending requests before this new federal administration would create undue uncertainty. So we will be considering additional alternative courses of action, particularly those that can be carried out under state authority and that will allow us to continue to reduce pollution and protect public health. For those that don't know, during the first Trump administration, we engaged in an estimated 25 litigation cases related to federal actions, and those were really aimed at defending our actions and authorities. As a result, one of the key priorities for this year will be to hold our ground by defending our authority under the Clean Air Act. So our legal team is closely tracking court cases, working with the Attorney General's office to respond proactively to defend against attacks to undermine our authority. As I mentioned before, another challenge that we face is something that's actually being shared across all departments in state government, and that is really the reality of our budget challenges in California. So last year, all state department budgets experienced reductions. That included the elimination of vacancies and an almost 8% reduction in state operational budgets. So that includes our contracts, procurements, and other type of operational expenditures. With these cuts, the timelines for certain activities will have to be extended, and there will be certain activities that we just can't support. We have weathered budgetary challenges before, and we know how critical it will be to be disciplined in how we spend our increasingly limited resources and making sure that we're prioritizing our most impactful efforts. And I did want to make sure, because I've mentioned previously some of our budget challenges, so I just wanted to make sure that that was really clear to the EJAC. Now I'll say next slide. I think we went a little bit ahead, but that's okay. So now this is the slide here. I do want to note that we will remain steadfast in our mission to address California's air pollution problems and really lead on effective climate action. So we're going to continue our efforts to address historical inequities, to deliver tangible benefits to communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate and pollution. So this includes some of the tools we developed. That's our racial equity lens, our community engagement model, really thinking about how that informs our decision making, how we engage with impacted communities, and to make sure that those that are impacted are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of our work at CARB. We will be focusing on implementing key existing programs while also developing new programs and regulations. And really the goal of this is to make sure that these efforts work together to develop meaningful results to improve air quality, address climate change, and pave the way for a more sustainable and inclusive future. Next slide. And then we'll go to the next slide. So this is our California Climate Investments, also known as CCI. Last year, the California Climate Investment celebrated over a decade of process. That's more than $11 billion of cap and trade auction proceeds that are being invested throughout the state. More than 75% of those investments have been documented to be providing direct benefits to disadvantaged communities and low-income communities and households. California Climate Investments will continue to collaborate with 27 state agencies across more than 110 programs to support projects in clean energy, affordable housing, public transit, short-lived climate pollutants, and nature-based solutions. Through this collaboration, we really do plan to continue to prioritize the efforts to help ensure the benefits reach the most disadvantaged and low-income communities and households, and that really does include increasing access for tribes and unincorporated communities. This team will also be focused on uplifting economic opportunities and climate resilience efforts through the portfolio by supporting high-quality jobs, enhancing affordability, and addressing climate risks and adaptation benefits. Next slide. This is our community air protection. And so on this end, we are going to continue to support the community air protection and collaborate with communities and the air districts. We have 19 selected communities that represent over 4 million people, and that is a quarter of the population identified as disadvantaged under Cal Virus Screen. And we are working collaboratively to develop or implemented board-approved community emission reduction programs, or also known as CERPs. As of May 2024, over $550 million of community air protection incentives have been invested statewide. Of these funds, over $215 million have funded more than 4,500 projects within these 19 communities. For 2025, the program is expected to reach several milestones. So later in the spring, the staff are going to bring to the board a slate of candidates for the AB 617 consultation group. We're going to award close to $16 million in community air grants to community-based organizations and tribes, and we will be launching a peer-to-peer learning series. Then this summer, the board will hear a report on the program's annual progress, and later this year, staff will also update the Community Air Protection Incentives Program guidelines, and we will continue to support the statewide mobile monitoring initiative in consistently nominated communities. Next slide. Now I want to highlight our transportation and off-road efforts. The transportation sector remains the largest source of air pollution in California, so making continued progress in this area is central to CARB's mission. At the end of 2024 and early 2025, CARB received 6 waivers and authorizations, granting us authority to enforce regulatory packages that will drive significant pollution reductions in passenger cars and heavy-duty vehicles. In particular, I want to call out the federal waiver for the Advanced Clean Cars 2, you might hear that as ACC2 regulation, that allows California to fully implement and enforce requirements that would move the state towards 100% in sales of zero-emission vehicles by 2035. So this year, manufacturers will produce and sell that first set of vehicles to meet the ACC2 requirements. Staff are also going to bring proposed amendments to the board for consideration to clarify certain parts and certain provisions related to zero emission vehicle certification, and also to continue CARB's process in supporting the market with new consumer-focused assurance measures. CARB will continue to implement and enforce these 6 regulatory packages. That includes the heavy-duty omnibus regulation, which will drastically reduce smog-forming emissions, particulate matter, and nitrogen oxides from heavy-duty vehicles, as well as requirements for smaller off-road engines. So that includes lawnmowers, leaf blowers, off-road vehicles, and authorized portions affecting commercial hovercrafts and refrigerated trucks. If you didn't know, we did withdraw the remaining authorization requests, as I mentioned before. That includes our advanced clean fleet regulation and the in-use locomotive regulatory package. For both regulations, we are currently evaluating the next steps. We do remain committed to achieving the goals laid out in the governor's 2020 executive order, which establishes a goal that 100% of medium and heavy duty vehicles in the state be zero emission by 2045, where feasible, and then at 2035 for drayage trucks. For advanced clean fleet, or ACF, CARB is not going to enforce the parts that require federal authorization. So that includes portions that apply to high priority and drayage fleets, However, not all elements of ACF regulation require a federal waiver or authorization, and that's like the state and local government fleets requirements. So CARB will be implementing and enforcing the state and local requirements. We also have the Advanced Clean Trucks Regulation, which received a waiver in 2023, and the Clean Truck Partnership, which is an agreement made by the nation's manufacturers to reach 100% zero emission sales by 2036. So both of those are critical tools to help us reach the goals laid out in the governor's executive order. Next slide. And then we'll skip this slide. Now I'll transition to some of the new initiatives and regulations that CARB will be prioritizing in 2025. So short-lived climate pollutants, that's methane, which we've already heard about, are powerful climate pollutants with a global warming potential that are tens of thousands of times greater than CO2. CARB will take additional efforts to slash their emissions. Decomposition of organic waste at landfills emits methane and makes landfills the second largest source of methane emissions in California. Under the Early Action Landfill Methane Regulation of 2010, California landfill operators are required to install and operate gas collection systems at landfills to capture and use fugitive methane. In 2025, staff will be proposing regulatory updates to this regulation to improve emissions monitoring, leverage more recent technology developments, improve gas collection system operations, and improve administration of this regulation. CARB is also leveraging innovative technology through the Methane Satellite Data Project, which we heard about earlier from Research Division, and that's going to use advanced remote sensing to detect large methane leaks in California and globally. So one philanthropic funded satellite was launched in August of 2024. And I think, as we mentioned, CARB anticipates awarding a $95 million contract in the coming months for additional satellite data. I'll just kind of reiterate what Elizabeth shared, that we also plan to release that $5 million community grant program solicitation to engage communities in this effort. With this information, CARB is going to start notifying operators in 2025, so swift action can be taken to address identified leaks. To support this effort, CARB has also amended its oil and gas methane regulation to require oil and gas facility operators to act promptly upon notification of methane plumes. And we are exploring similar provisions as a part of the landfill methane regulation amendments. Next slide. As a part of the 2022 scoping plan, 2022 EJAC was really a huge part of that push for higher VMT targets to help us achieve our greenhouse gas emissions. To really help achieve that goal, CARB will be updating its SB 375 planning targets, which will reduce the need for vehicle travel and also help us achieve our state climate goals. SB 375 does require the California Metropolitan Planning Organizations and those regional entities to develop sustainable community strategies that are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicle travel. To guide these strategies, CARB sets a greenhouse gas emission reduction target for the MPO regions, which must be updated at least every 8 years. The current target update process is currently underway and must be completed by 2026. To support this effort, our staff will be hosting a statewide public workshop, and they will be releasing a draft report with target recommendations for public review and comment in the third quarter of this year. Next slide. Here, I just want to note that we are prepared to support the administration and the legislature as they consider extending the cap and trade program beyond 2030 to achieve carbon neutrality. I do want to make a note here and make sure that it's really just clear that on our end, the EJAC has done a number of resolutions. We support that. I think we see our role to make sure that we're supporting that and we're getting that information to our board members. So we do not in any way want to be seen or communicated as we're saying don't have a resolution. I think what we wanted to kind of just emphasize here is that ultimately the administration and the legislature are the ones that will be extending this program. And so if there's recommendations around that kind of extension, those would be best given to the legislature. It doesn't mean that we're saying, please don't give a resolution. So I just want to make sure that was clear here, and make sure people understood that part of it right there. So in addition to kind of that support of the administration of the legislature, we also will be conducting rulemaking activities to support carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as well as corporate greenhouse gas emission reporting and corporate climate financial risk disclosure. Those are all required by SB 905, SB 253, and SB 261. So the state's leadership in these areas is critical to attract funding for innovation and technologies needed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, and to provide public transparency on how large corporations are responding to the science of climate change and acting to do their part on GHG emissions. So over the coming months, staff will be holding workshops on the implementation of the bills that I listed earlier, and we will make sure that we are sharing that information with the EJAC as things move forward. One of the things that I will say is that just to kind of like to start to implement what I think I've heard in this meeting, for those that don't know, there is going to be a workshop on SB 905. I believe that we may have sent out that announcement, but if we haven't, we can certainly do so. But I just wanted to flag that as I'm talking about that workshop that's coming up. Next slide. Ensuring affordable and equitable access to transportation fuels will also be key. In late 2024, CARB received a letter from Governor Newsom that asked the agency to prioritize the multimedia evaluation of E15, which is a statutory requirement for CARB and other Cali PA departments to evaluate potential air, soil, water, and other impacts when considering whether to modify regulations allowing ethanol use in California gasoline to increase from 10% by volume to 15%. The governor's proposed budget includes needed resources to support this effort. In addition, we will also continue to coordinate with the California Energy Commission to engage the public through community meetings and ongoing discussions with the legislatively created working group on the development of the Transportation Fuels Transition Plan as required by SBX1. Next slide. I'll close with this. As I noted, we will have an array of unprecedented challenges, but on our end, these obstacles will not deter us. This year, CARB, California, has chosen to stand at the forefront to defend clean air, science-based public health protections, and climate efforts. That is really the part that we see ourselves playing. So to meet these challenges, 2025 is going to require a level of discipline from us to stand our ground, to remain focused on the core activities and programs that deliver tangible results in improving air quality and combating climate change. It will also demand resiliency from all of us to adapt to an evolving landscape and the creativity to explore new and innovative approaches. And this really is an effort that is going to span across our entire organization. With that said, thank you so much, and I will turn it back over to you, Jane.
Thank you. We'll look to see if there's any discussion from the committee on that. All right, Luis, I see your card up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I mean, in general, we know that CARB and California are leaders on climate, clean energy, clean transportation. We're very fortunate to live in a state that maintains those priorities and is willing to defend them. And I understand this is a very high-level presentation overview. However, just hopefully, as advice, the fact that we are an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, I wanted to make some recommendations. I do notice that we talk about racial equity, community engagement, and in some other areas we talk about environmental justice and equity. And I know in the past I have brought the importance of updating the environmental justice policy for the California Resources Board, which is over 20 years old, and there's been a lot of progress. And I think that's fair and would be beneficial to the California Air Resources Board to update it. I understand that depending on who's seeing the heavy lift or the strategy to update it may see it as a lot of work or may find strategic ways to be able to get it done. I mean, environmental justice exists in many communities, similar like the research division went out and put together their plan. I don't see why it's been something that has been put on the back burner. There are environmental justice organizations throughout the state of California. Bring them together. They are working on community. They are very well aware of what's happening in their communities, and they can help bring in that experience and help inform the development of an updated environmental justice policy, as well as for CARB to be able to add it to that policy. You know, there's a lot of progress here that's not in there. The other thing I wanted to recommend, some of these don't have, well, I think none of them, most of them don't have an explanation of the photos. So it wasn't very clear to me what part was environmental justice. So I just wanted to recommend that when selecting pictures, probably a good idea to also just keep that in mind. So as I look community air protection, I see regulatory monitoring. I don't see communities participating in, and there's been enormous investments in communities. So that's just one example. When it comes to climate investments, I know there's a lot of great examples. And so, you know, I think that if you can identify pictures and help uplift examples where, like e-bikes, that's extraordinary. You know, there's a lot of funding, and I know that in this recent go-around, I think it was the Energy Commission or CARB, who has that e-bike program? Those incentives went real fast, so obviously there's a need. But we also know that there are barriers in many communities. And same, you know, in terms of cost, we are very dependent, communities are very dependent on these incentives being there, and that they are targeted to disadvantaged environmental justice communities who can't afford it. There is, you know, there's a picture here about, at a glance, if I didn't know any better, I mean, it looks like a refinery, right? You can't tell the difference if it's a biofuel or a regular gas pump. So I think having some explanation on these photos might be a little bit clearer for those who may interpret that clean fuels may or may not be, because it's not very clear, right? It might look like a gas pump to anyone else, but I'm assuming that's some type of biodiesel there and some type of clean fuel source. And then we have food production. But I can't help but to think that, you know, whenever we have food as a product to create biofuels, it also puts food in a situation where there might be rising costs of food. And when I see corn, and we're thinking about, you know, culture, diets, corn is for a Latino population, and depending, I guess, where you're from, I mean, it's for tortillas. You know, that makes masa for tamales. That makes food. You know, I mean, it's a scary thought that at some point corn may not be there affordably because it's being utilized for biofuels. And the other is that, yes, it's cleaner. I think it's more appropriate to call it cleaner. Just like in Imperial, there's an effort to try to extract lithium, and we know that it's not ideal. I mean, we wish that solar was in a situation where We can store it in a vehicle, and you can just operate efficiently with solar, where it's not utilizing water, it's not having to be extractive, where you're also pulling toxic chemicals, where it's harmful to the community. So, as an organization, in consultation with many environmental justice leaders throughout the country, and I'm not saying that everybody agrees with this, but we call it transitional minerals, because we know that maybe hydrogen will be more efficient, maybe solar will be more efficient, and maybe this is just a technology for the next 30, 40 years, and then something better will come along in between that time. So I think when we talk about clean fuels, it's probably fair to say it's cleaner fuels, right? Because it's not entirely clean, because it signals to our communities, hey, don't worry about it, but yet are creating impacts. There is emissions coming out. So again, California is moving in the right direction, and my comments are not intended at all to discourage or to stop California from moving in the direction that it is. But I've also see that there isn't very clear. Like, I like to see a one-pager. Like, what's CARB's commitment to racial equity? What does it look like? Give me the definition. What does environmental justice mean to CARB? I want a clear explanation, because we're utilizing all this language, but it's not very clear to me. And I think it's fair to have that one pager. I want to know how it is both in the language, but also both enforceable. And I find myself more and more as I, we're in the situation with lithium being such an important opportunity for the Imperial Valley, now known as Lithium Valley. And I have countless interviews, and they talk about these opportunities, economic opportunities. And it's like the next best thing right now. It's like, this is going to help your community get out of, poverty and environmental issues. But one of the things that I often bring up is, yes, we've been promised through solar, but yet it didn't follow through. Yes, we've been promised that. There's been so many broken dreams, empty promises, and it all goes back to one thing, is that we didn't have it written, and it wasn't enforceable. So enforcement and making sure that there's signed, written, board approved, executive approved, whatever it is, the order in which this needs to be done, that environmental justice communities can come back and say, hey, it's written here and it didn't happen. And so we want to make sure, because there was an agreement, there was a signature on it. And so I like to encourage, especially since CARB has an Office of Environmental Justice, that whenever we're being presented something or promised something, that it is written, signed, and enforced. Because we've already seen that in this country, if it ain't signed, written, and enforceable, it's just going to be another opportunity for a broken promise. So, thank you.
Thank you. Seeing a few hands raised, we'll go to Jill, and then Dr. Catherine, and then Matt. Jill, you might be on mute.
Darn it. Sorry. Thank you for those wise words to my colleague. I appreciate what you shared. And I want, I know that CARB, has most of their programs that they spelled out are very high level, and there isn't, but we all know, as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. And it's the details that kind of drive the things that I'm experiencing as a person of color on a variety of levels, the actions of CARB. And one example is the Indian Health Clinic that I go to bought a mobile unit, a mobile health unit to better serve the community. And it's having a hard time with registering that vehicle because there's no paperwork that says that the vehicle isn't allowed to be used in California unless you do a smog and then you see the stamp on the engine that says not, I don't know what it says exactly, but it's that engine can't be used in California. And it's a mobile medical unit. I don't know how many other clinics that are serving small communities in rural locations or even in urban locations that are coming across experiencing these things. I know that there's also a clinic in San Diego that's experiencing the same thing. And so how, these vehicles are expensive. It's $50,000, and to have these vehicles just sitting unused because they can't get registered in the state of California, but then there was no way to know that it couldn't be sold in the state of California. It just boggles my mind. And so I think it really behooves CARB staff to drill down into some of those details. My colleague mentioned the e-bike program, and they opened it up. I'm not even really sure how you're supposed to know that it was opened up, but it opened up, and I think it was open for 20 minutes, and the 2,000 bike spaces were gone in that time. And having worked with one of the programs previously, there was no equity in allowing for people who had with disabilities to access e-bikes. They had to pay additional costs out of their pocket when equity should be, it might mean that for equity purposes, it would be more than $2,000. But nope, the rule was only $2,000 per bike. So too bad if you're disabled, then, you just need to pay out of pocket. Again, the devil is in the details in that process. Then for rural communities, I'm actually quite frankly shocked that my internet is staying up. I only have one bar. Because if you don't have internet and you don't have cell service, and let me tell you, even in Hoopa, San Diego, a lot of the remote communities in California have been on 3 weeks worth of power outages. And if you are out of power and you don't have cell service and and these programs come up on the internet, well, you're just, out of luck. Again, because there's no equity in how they're doing it. We're just going to put the shot out there on the internet and believe that everyone has internet. I'm sorry, not everyone has internet. And what did we hear today? We have people in the middle of LA who are having problems with the internet. And so, I think there should have been some set-asides for people to do mail-ins. I know it's old-fashioned and out of date. My son just told me that they don't like phone calls. They want texts. Okay, great. Well, I don't know what you're going to do when you're 7 and you can't see your phone. But, equity. And so I know that's a dirty word these days, but California has always been the leader. And that's something I always talk about, California being the leader in air quality, having driven some of those purposes, that's important. I think it puts CARB in a unique position with tribes because under the Clean Air Act, a federal act, tribes, there's something called the Tribal Authority Rule, the TAR, which gives tribes entire jurisdiction under the federal law, entire federal jurisdiction for their airspace. My brother Kevin talked about having this emergency response. Sorry, I didn't really get exactly how it worked, but your emergency response for air quality. There are many tribes within the state that are operating their own air quality programs. So, we need to find a way to work better together and to be down in the dirty details. And, I don't want to overburden you, Chanel, because sometimes I feel like our whole group as the EJAC, we're not alone as tribes. We are all experiencing the same thing as people of color, and kind of this polite ignoring of us. When Luis was talking, I was like, oh my gosh, he could be giving a speech for tribes, saying the same things that we say over and over again to Congress. And I just want us to be mindful of the overarching large priorities, but also the details that exist within those priorities. We have to know what those are and what barriers might exist. So that's just kind of my overall feedback. But there's going to be a tribe out there that has enough juice in their tribal air program to really get California to see that we could be potentially extremely helpful in furthering our air quality priorities, because of the tribal air authority rule in the Clean Air Act. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we continue to the next comment or discussion with the committee, checking in with CARB staff. Chanel, I see your hand raised. I wasn't sure if you wanted to comment now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to. I think one, I just wanted to acknowledge it and appreciate, Luis, your comments. That makes a ton of sense to me. I will hit you up on the side because I do want to kind of brainstorm and talk with you about the EJ policy in particular. And I feel like you have been faithful in bringing that up. So I just really appreciated that. And then I think, Jill, it would be really helpful to talk with you, maybe it's one-on-one, about some of what you're flagging. It sounds like, for example, like the vehicles that you were talking about, it sounds like they're getting flagged by our emission compliance and certification team. And a lot of that really is like the way that it kind of works. I mean, as you know this, right? Like our regulations are really designed to get in more and more cleaner vehicles. And the goal is to then, right, so we're starting to see some of those clean air benefits. And so I'm not sure what vehicles you're talking about. I'm not sure like some of the technology that's happening there. So I think just in general, it'd be helpful to get more information and more specificity, because I think on one hand, right, I think we're kind of hearing the push of like, we need to get to zero emission vehicles. We need to accelerate that as quickly as possible. But I also, again, I don't have enough information to know, right, of like, are you talking about like clean vehicles? Are these not? I just don't know. So I think like having that conversation and understanding how it fits into like our certification and compliance and what we're trying to do on that front would be really helpful. On the e-bikes, I know that some of these issues that you brought up, you've also brought up in our Tribal Advisory Council, which is hosted by the California Environmental Protection Agency. And so one of the things that I think we are focused on, right, is following up, because one, I think I was really concerned. I kind of heard some of the concerns around adaptive bikes and like them not being affordable. This is one thing that I think, I think we're planning to bring that back to the TAC. We'd love to bring that back to the EJAC as well, because there was a lot of publicity, I think, on that e-bike program, but I hear you bringing up that like, hey, it sounds like it didn't get to the right people. So really having that constructive conversation again, am I like, what does it look like and how can we improve on that engagement front? But then two, I think making sure that we're clear and we understand like some of the concerns that are happening around the adaptive pieces of it. I think maybe some of the things that I'm hearing from that team feel different from your experience, right? Like I think I'm hearing like, here's how we change things to accommodate, but that feels different than what you're sharing. So I just wanted to kind of like make sure that we're calling that out and we're having that discussion, you and I, and we can certainly bring that back to the EJAC and the TAC as well, because I do want to make sure that we're being responsive in terms of both, I think, those adaptability concerns that you brought up on the e-bikes, but as well as understanding some of the issues it sounds like you're flagging again with like emission compliance and certification.
Thank you. To continue the discussion with the committee, I'll turn it over to Dr. Catherine and then to Matt.
Thank you. So recognizing that this presentation was a summary of a presentation that Dr. Cliff gave to the CARB board, I do still have the feeling of, a phrase that comes to mind is two ships passing in the night. Maybe they're electric ships. Maybe the decarbonized version is two bikes passing on the bike path. I'm not sure. But I am still left with the question, what does all of this information mean for environmental justice communities? What does this information mean for EJAC? So to put in a little of my own work in that exercise and starting with the challenges, I think it connects back to what Martha Dina and I said in our opening comments about what's happening at the federal level should not be an excuse for California to say, well, we're a leader, so we're going to keep leading on this, because we still have the two most polluted air basins in the entire United States. So we still have a ton of work left to do. And economically, we are one of the wealthiest places in the world, but it's not evenly distributed. It's incredibly inequitable. I fully acknowledge that that's not completely up to CARB, but I continue to struggle to see how those challenges are explicitly being addressed in CARB's programs. And sometimes, in fact, they're being skipped over. The other challenge that was mentioned was the state budget. And obviously, environmental justice organizations are really familiar with being under-resourced and being asked to do a lot of work. Specific to the EJAC, I have heard budgetary challenges used multiple times to tell us no on things that we've asked for related to the charter. No, you can't have extra meetings. No, you can't have more members because we don't have enough money. But without being asked, EJAC, since we became permanent, has had less members. We've traveled less. We've had shorter meetings. I think we're pretty efficient with the resources that we have as EJAC. And I'm disappointed that we keep being shut down around basic asks for things that really are not about costs. It doesn't cost that much more to have additional members. Back to the presentation specifically itself, obviously there was the call out for the racial equity lens and the community engagement model. I believe there's also a consulting team working on a racial equity framework. Those to me sound very process heavy. And process is important, but it can also be limited, and it can stretch people's capacity to participate across these multiple processes without a clear outcome. So where are the actions? How are we actually changing the distribution of pollution in environmental justice neighborhoods by bringing those emissions down? And I often hear, well, California climate investments and air monitoring through AB 617. In my experience in the San Joaquin Valley, those are not reaching low-income households. And oftentimes what they're packaged in is incentives for industry that oftentimes is actually subsidizing their expansion in our environmental justice communities. So I still want to know what actual actions CARB is taking that is bringing down emissions in environmental justice neighborhoods. That is the nexus that I am frustrated that we seem to continue to fail to miss the mark on. Last point, I'm glad to hear that there is a continued receptivity and openness to EJAC passing resolutions. I definitely don't think we're going to stop doing that, regardless of the way that they're received at CARB. I think we will continue doing them. And to be clear, when we're talking about cap and trade, there is a role that the legislature has to play in extending the program. There is also a lot about the program that is already within CARB's authority. And in fact, our resolution asked, if it is not within CARB's authority or they do not have the political will to do these recommendations, tell us why. And specifically, facility level caps was called out in a conversation as, well, I don't even know if CARB has the authority because I just don't entertain it as an idea, so I've never asked, right? That's a problem. Like, you're not even taking our recommendations seriously to know whether you have the authority to do it or not. That's not a take it to the legislature. That's a, I just think you have a bad idea, so I'm not going to entertain it. I'm very interested in dialogue and collaboration, and I think that we're not there yet. And another example, I think, is SB 905 and the community protections and that conversation that we've been waiting for a really long time. So I think that's some of my feedback on the presentation and also some of what I wanted to share with the committee in terms of priorities that we have continued to uplift and conversations that we need to continue to have. That frankly, I don't think we've gotten a whole lot of answers on, but that doesn't mean that we stop asking the questions.
Thank you. Going to Matt Holmes.
I'll withdraw my hand. I don't have anything to add to that. I'll let that sink in on some people.
Thank you. We'll pause for a moment, see if there's any additional. Oh, go ahead, Luis.
One other strategy that I would like to just put as an important point for discussion. We've recently have taken the challenge to build electric vehicle charging stations. We don't come from a development background. We are not a business. We're a nonprofit. And the motivation for that was that as Imperial Lithium Valley was looking towards extracting what is a substantially large amount of lithium deposit, that the community did not have access to reliable EV infrastructure. In fact, I think per capita, we were either the last or among the last of number of EV chargers available. So I'm really glad that CARB has a program to make clean vehicles or clean transportation for low-income, prioritizing low-income families. And that is great. It would have been a challenge if we weren't able to build the infrastructure, which I believe we have built the largest infrastructure in the Imperial Valley now with 16 chargers or 32 connections, which puts Imperial Valley ahead of the growing demand. And we see that growing persistently. It is also an economic model that returns money back into the community, because as a nonprofit, you are required to dedicate 100% of revenues, grants, contracts back into community beneficial programs. So it is a model, a business model that I think has been largely overseen. And I like to encourage CARB to make that a conversation of how CARB can provide guidance, or even whenever it has opportunities to direct funds that it builds in and prioritizes, whether it be solar or biofuels. I think we've proven that a nonprofit is not only good to go out there and do outreach and engagement, that nonprofits can also help build and deploy renewable energy technologies in a business model that creates a circular reinvestment of monies into communities that have largely been exploited and not necessarily benefit from industries that have contributed to air pollution and the climate crisis. A diverse portfolio is necessary. I'm not at all saying that there shouldn't be a diversity of types of investments and types of business. I'm just saying a largely overlooked industry is the nonprofit industry that can also engage in that and create that circular economy locally. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing Martha Dina and then Chanel.
Well, I appreciate that and SB 905 is part of the implementation. I'm very concerned that there's already projects that are moving through the approval process without guidelines in place. And not that I have a lot of confidence in the guidelines as being protective or that they might be enforced, but it does worry me that there is this rush to start permitting these facilities without there actually being guidelines in place. And the harm that is putting a lot of communities in harm's way. And I just think it's a tremendous failure that this is where we are.
Thank you, Chanel.
I just want to say one, I think this is really helpful feedback and like I think all critique is like valid. So I just want to acknowledge that up front because I don't want to feel like, oh my God, Chanel's being defensive. Like I'm not. I think I'm just taking it and absorbing. And so I just really appreciate this conversation and kind of what we're hearing. Um, and I hear you, Martha, kind of in terms of like 905. And so part of what I think we are trying to do, right, is be transparent in what we're moving forward, right? So kind of I think I know that we flagged it for the co-chairs, but also want to make sure everybody knows, right, that this workshop is happening. We want to make sure that the EJAC voice is a part of it. And as we're moving forward with this, right, we're building in the EJAC in the process. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and say that on 905. And I think I also did want to just again like reflect and appreciate the kind of Luis with the comments that you're bringing up around the role of like nonprofits. So I hope we can find time to talk to. And then I think whether it's a smaller group, whether it's in this meeting, I'm fine. But I think to your point, Catherine, I do feel like we are a little bit like maybe it's two electric ships passing in the night. Like it's fine. I do feel like that a little bit because I think part of what we had hoped, for example, right, is to kind of list out like, hey, like there are these regulations that are coming up, right? There are different things. Like I think what at least I was trying to do in part was basically tee up like, hey, here are some of the things that are coming up. Can we have a conversation and think through like, is this something that is important or is this something that is like that EJAC is interested in? Can we have that conversation? So I kind of hear you being like, well, what are we doing? And I think on our end, we're kind of thinking like, here is like the list of the priorities. So I think if there's a different format, a different way to have that conversation, I am super open to it. But I did just want to acknowledge, like, again, it could be that two ships passing in the night, but I do feel like that is one thing that I do kind of want to just emphasize that we do feel like we're trying to do a lot on that front and we do want to partner with and dialogue with EJAC. And if we aren't there, it'd be great to know like what that looks like. And again, whether it's in this meeting space, another meeting, smaller group, bigger group, I just want to know and help to move that forward. I think on the budget point, I'm always transparent. I'm trying to be transparent on that front, right? Of like, these are cuts that are happening across the state agencies. And I do think you're right because there really isn't like, a budget allocation for the EJAC. The point on the more members inherently cost more money. So I guess I'm just a little bit like confused and I'm not asking you to like respond and I don't want to necessarily get in a back and forth, but a lot of this is just like trying to understand and wanting to understand. So that's part of why I'm flagging some of these things. The last point I would say on like the facility caps as one example, I think I remember that a little bit differently. I think in my mind, what I remember kind of it being was that we actually had a fair amount of conversations. We actually did a memo on it. And part of what I think we flagged was that this was not compatible with the legislative direction. And that's part of the reason why we brought it. At least I'd like to bring it to the legislature because it came from the legislature. That was my recollection. And that's kind of, I think, what we put in writing in our memo and put on the website. So again, my intent in saying all of this is not to be like, we're defensive. We need to like get in this back and forth. The intent is really just to figure out how we can understand each other and how we aren't just kind of like doing this. So I am really interested in what that looks like. How do we get to that place and how do we set that up?
Thank you. Continuing on this item, I see Kevin, your hand raised.
I want to echo Martha Dina's comments and raise back to you, Chanel, on this is how do we hold CARB accountable for supporting things, or let's put it this way, rather than supporting through failing to raise concerns when, as with 905, we see projects moving forward in communities when the language is very clear that this is not to happen until appropriate research is conducted and a process is developed. And so while you use the legislature as, it feels almost like a whip in a way that's forcing you to do X. And yet the legislature is, in this case, the legislation is actually saying, no, don't do that until this happens. Yet we haven't seen CARB calling the entities that are doing this to accountability based on that legislation. So, and that is sort of a list of things where CARB says we want to work on SB 375 and we want to reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled. And we're going to hold these various municipalities accountable. Yet we don't hold all the municipalities accountable. Regular passes on those numbers have been moved forward in the plans continuously. For instance, here in the San Joaquin Valley, where you have three of the largest cities in California, and yet they continue to get a pass every year. So it's okay if it's here, but up here it's not okay. So it really sends mixed messages in my mind, and I think in everybody's. Where does CARB stand on this? And again, the other piece is, how does it hold accountability to the other programs to make sure they're supporting that? For instance, I'm just using it as example, 375, because it's been around so long. The folks who are doing infrastructure, which we want to see more of. You want to get these communities off the road, well, make sure that they have tons of infrastructure in their multifamily dwellings. And instead, we're seeing new multifamily dwellings created on the housing side that we desperately need, but we're not seeing that infrastructure installed along with it. So, where is that interaction happening? And even within the agency, it often seems like the divisions are each sort of working on their own pathway. And so we would expect at the top that integration would happen, but we're not really seeing that. On the cap and trade side, speaking of accountability, that's really what we've been asking for. I can't imagine why CARB wouldn't want the same thing. Why wouldn't you want to hold bad actors accountable who are using the system pretty much just to continue doing what they're doing and make money from it? That's obvious and has been pointed out time and time again. And why isn't that language, at least, and a methodology for holding them accountable? And I'm not calling out any single one, just a way to do that built into what CARB is asking to do, asking the legislature to do, because they love that kind of stuff. That's certainly something they're probably interested in. And if you were to raise that as CARB, that we need this piece built in, at least we could feel like, well, we can get behind you on this and support that. But I haven't heard that. It was very much the same in the LCFS conversation. So it's hard to say, oh yeah, we're interested in this and we want to support you in this, when we don't see it going both ways. There's no equity there. At least that's what it feels like quite often. So you can change that. That's within your, by the way, it's also within your purview to change that. There's nothing in legislation that says you can't. And, here's the opportunity. We want to do that. We want to jump in there with you and fight against this federal administration that's trying to literally take down the Clean Air Act. And certainly some of us were surprised when CARB backed off and didn't keep pushing for the clean trucks. But I know you say you'll come back another time. We're still fighting that fight, and we'll continue to fight that fight for that program that's so critical. But how do we make it work here in California? How do we fit that in with everything else you say you're going to do? So sometimes it feels kind of like whack-a-mole around here. So we want to be there. We want to work with you. I appreciate that you did a slideshow and showed us everything that you're planning to do here in the various quarters moving forward. I find that very useful. But again, I'm trying to figure out where in those is there accountability. We're certainly holding the folks accountable up there at Jill's house, up there in her space, where they want to get a simple thing as a medical vehicle out there for themselves. So, I mean, we're really good at that at the local level, but that's about where it seems to begin and where it seems to end. And that's where the most damage occurs. So, I think CARB needs to take a good hard look at itself and think about that.
Thank you. Seeing Dr. Catherine's hand raised.
Yeah, so I want to appreciate, Chanel, your willingness to be here and be a part of dialogue and acknowledge that it's not always constructive to get into just a direct back and forth, and also recognize this is a public meeting venue. And I think there's a difference in conversations that happen here versus one-on-one or offline. And often you are the representative here for CARB, and there's only one of you, and there's only so much that you can change. And some of these conversations need to be broader and need to include other folks at CARB. So just a few specifics, and then I'm going to go back to the big picture. In terms of more members, my point was, yes, having more members by itself would increase costs in terms of the modest stipend that members receive. However, we've already saved you money by having less members, by having less meetings, by traveling less. So it feels a bit disingenuous to be told on the back end, oh, well, there are budget cuts, we can't support you all having more members, when we already agreed to a bunch of changes in the charter that frankly, I personally was not happy with having less members, right? But we negotiated, we compromised. And this time around, we have made it nowhere with the charter. We have found nothing that we agree with from CARB's end to EJAC's end, at least from my understanding of it. So it troubles me to hear the budget continue to be raised as a reason why we can't do more for EJAC, because I don't think the things that we're asking for are really that radical or cost a whole lot. I think CARB overall, if you take this seriously, would benefit from having a few more EJAC members, again, especially on balance, considering the way that we have tried to reduce costs and be more efficient. The second piece is about the facility level caps conversation, because again, this is where it gets complicated and we start to get into the weeds. So yes, in 2017, there were conversations in the legislature about facility level caps. So then I said, well, what about no trade zones? Because that's not exactly the same thing. Can CARB do that? Does CARB have that authority? And at that point, publicly, there was no answer. But in a private conversation, I was told, well, we don't really know if CARB has the legal authority to do that because we don't take that seriously as a proposal. That's what I'm talking about in terms of things that we're proposing just being outright dismissed. If we can't even have a theoretical conversation about how would this work, could CARB do this, what would it look like? To me, that's a missed opportunity to try to address a very long-standing issue that environmental justice communities have raised about the disproportionate impact that climate programs, particularly carbon markets like cap and trade, like low carbon fuel standard, have on environmental justice communities. So part of why I repeatedly bring it up is because we get into this, well, the legislature said in 2017 we can't have facility level caps, end of the conversation. For me, it's not the end of the conversation. It's way more complicated than that, and we need to keep talking about it. Ditto on SB 905 to Martha Dina and Kevin's comments. Again, we've heard in public meetings, public EJAC meetings, that it's a priority to roll out what CARB needs to do for industry and to give them credits so that the projects will be more affordable to them. But we don't hear anything about the need to protect environmental justice communities. And we do have projects in the San Joaquin Valley that are already moving forward, which brings me back to a conversation that I think this body has had the entire time that I've been on here, which is it's important to discuss these specific issues. And also part of what we need is broader cultural change at the Air Resources Board in terms of the way that you engage with and take environmental justice recommendations seriously. That to me is the analogy about two ships passing in the night. I don't think you and I are passing in the night, Chanel, but I think CARB and EJAC are not really engaging in the way that I think we could to actually make real progress.
Thank you, Chanel.
Oh man, that was a lot, and I saw Martha Dina put her hand down. Okay, a couple of thoughts. Kevin, you said a lot, and I tried to take notes, and I didn't get all of it. I'm gonna try to get some of the points that I did here because I think the overall point was around accountability. I think on 905, I would just welcome like a conversation on 905. Again, I'm kind of like it's ambivalent to me of how we set that up, but I think one of the things that I would point to, because you're absolutely right, for folks that maybe you're listening and don't know, there are permit approvals that are happening on 905, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about when we're referencing. One of the things that I will just note is that kind of in our memo, what we did share, right, is like there was a question kind of like, what role will like we CARB have in terms of like the permitting process? And I think on our end, I think we've had this conversation with a subset of like advocates, maybe with a subset of EJEC members, I can't remember. But on our end, I think what we kind of said was that it doesn't give us any new permitting authority, for example, right? And so part of what's happening is that we are seeing things moving forward in the permitting process because in our, right, what we said was like, we don't have that permitting authority. I'm not saying that to incite anything. I'm saying that because that is kind of what we've said and been consistent on. And that would be great for us to have that conversation with EJAC and to get more in detail on that with 905. So I'm offering that up. And I love what you said, Catherine, because I'm one person, but I think there are many people that are working on things like this, like 905, for example. So I don't mind, like if that's something we want to put on the agenda, that would be a great conversation to have. So I just wanted to kind of flag that one, for example, right, as one where it's like, if we're seeing things moving forward in the permitting process, it's right because we didn't get any new permitting authority. But they're not moving forward on the things that are under the 905 umbrella. But let's have that conversation. You mentioned 375. I think Kevin, Catherine, probably most of you know. I would love to have a conversation on 375. And I kind of hear you bringing up like, well, how does it connect to some of the infrastructure? How does it connect, right? Like, how are we connecting this to the bigger picture? And so that is one place where, like, again, I'm just kind of being very vocal and saying, yes, would love to have this conversation. Would love to not only get input, but just to kind of hear, like, where are the gaps happening on that front? And then I probably missed something because you did say a lot, but on ACF, you did kind of hear me saying, right, like we did pull it back. The waiver, just kind of that uncertainty there. We are looking at the places where we can move forward around the state and local requirements. But I think, again, like if this is something where like the EJAC is like, we want to be a part of this conversation, we want to think about it. Everything that we're talking about, part of why I'm bringing it up is because we want to have these conversations and we want to think through some of these pieces around like, what does that accountability look like? And again, you know, I'm here right now, but if we're setting up these conversations, it doesn't have to be me. Like I think you guys heard methane satellites from like Elizabeth, right? So I think we can bring other people to this conversation and to have that dialogue. Got it. I hear you, Catherine, though, on the more members. And yeah, I don't think we have to go back and forth on that, but I do think that I get what you're saying around the saving money. We do see it a little differently. I think that's something that we can talk about. And like, honestly, in that EJEC charter subgroup, I don't think everybody has to be part of it unless you all want to be. Again, not gatekeeping anything here. And it was helpful when you kind of acknowledged the facility caps piece and the difference with the no trade zones. That was really helpful for me because I do think we responded to facility caps. And I don't know if we may have responded to trade zones, but I would have to check and see. But I hear your point of like, I'm one person, so that one I don't really know about. So I hear you on that as well. And I think overall, kind of what I hear on that like culture shift, part of what I'm hoping that we can start to do, in part by like bringing, like I said, we brought research and hearing some of these other priorities around 375, 905, you know, ACF, right? Like we can bring people in to have these conversations and to start to hear and hopefully contribute to that culture change. But I also think that there is more I think that we can do on our end. And I think I like when you said that, Catherine, of owning our own part as the EJAC and gave some constructive feedback, right? Because I think that also helps us as well as like, what can the EJAC do? What can CARB do? And can we have those conversations? So I tried to get everything that I heard. I probably missed something. But mostly my point is that I do want to, like, as much as we can, especially in this year, be as forthcoming and as transparent as I can be. And also, I think, make sure that it's not just me, but we're bringing the people that are leading some of these efforts to the EJAC directly too.
Thank you. So taking a moment to check in on the agenda and our time so far, it's about 4:13. We have 3 items to go. Agenda item 11 would be the EJAC 2025 priorities. And then we also want to make sure we leave time for public comment and our next steps and closing remarks. I think we have concluded item number 10, and so we will move now to a discussion around EJAC's 2025 priorities. I think I'll start with the co-chairs if they'd like to kick that off.
Sure, this is Dr. Catherine again. I'll just briefly reiterate what I mentioned off the top, which is that the carbon markets work group does want to continue conversations on cap and trade as that rulemaking is impending, and that also there have been some recent updates relevant to building decarbonization that I'm looking to land as conversations in the next few months. And with that, I'll pass it to Martha Dina and open it up to committee members, and also acknowledge that I think the dialogue we were just having, we already were surfacing some of our priorities.
Yes, I think, 905 and actually having real safeguards that protect communities, not ways to push forward on this unproven technology. Definitely building decarb, and some of the other issues that have been surfaced here today. I think, and for me, sort of as we get near term limits, really seeing how we deepen the bench of EJ leaders who want to serve and are willing to serve. We were really excited. We were awarded a grant to one of the EPA grants to actually develop a training institute to prepare people to serve on all the new EJACs, and it was awarded, but that is now in limbo. And so we, because I recognize the need to really support folks when they serve, because it's not always easy to show up prepared and understand all the technical issues that we have to deal with. So I think I'm going to really think about how we have a good transition as our terms come up.
Thank you. Additional priorities or discussion on this item from committee members? Thomas?
Said this before, and I think it goes along with everything the co-chairs and the other members were saying, but I'll just reiterate it again. An across the board rule that these programs are not giving funding or credits or whatever the giveaway is from the state of California with our tax money go to a project that's going to increase pollution in either in a disadvantaged community, defined disadvantaged community, or top 75% on CalEnviro screen or whatever it might be that we used to show that this community is already overburdened, and that even a net increase, which because I'm thinking of the reason that we're given of why a biofuels place is going to open up in a disadvantaged community, is that it's lowering emissions that are happening somewhere else. And actually, now that I say that, I want those communities that if they feel like they want to replace their refinery with a biofuels place, then those communities and those groups should decide that. So I'll take that back. But as far as my communities go, we're adding pollution. We're not decreasing it. In that same community, we're just adding, and that should include indirect sources and a full analysis of the pollution that will be brought because of a state sanctioned and promoted program. We need to start, as the term I've heard before, reverse redlining these facilities. Put them in the wealthy communities that don't have other sources of pollution, if you want to put them somewhere. I think that's just common sense. Ask from an environmental justice perspective that if all of this is meant to fight climate change but not reinforce the same cycle of of dumping on the most disadvantaged communities and overburdened communities with pollution than a simple across the board rule that credits and funding programs are not going to go to a project that's going to increase pollution in what's already considered a disadvantaged community or an environmental justice community already overburdened with pollution. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional discussion on this item from the committee.
Well, I feel obligated to bring up that we could use a deep dive on the natural working land strategy with the experts from that expert advisory committee. That could also be somewhere, but we could also recruit the chair from that committee and a couple of the specialists to present to this committee. They wanted that input before they wrote their final recommendations, but I think that discussion of that strategy has been delayed, reasonably so, for all of the energy department fetishes that we've been fending off. But there's also a time sensitivity to implementation of the natural and working land strategy that relates directly to the worst outcomes of climate change. Not talking about it for another year would be disappointing.
Thank you, Matt.
And also the research conversation that earlier, I really appreciate what they're doing. They're trying to develop an inclusive plan. I think we could do a little bit of that ourselves in this committee and talk about like the amount of fantastic participatory research projects that people on this call are involved in, and how much stronger CARB is when it wants to create a policy when it includes the folks in these squares.
Thank you. Martha Dina, I see your hand.
Well, I actually have a question and a challenge to Matt. So what is it that we need to do so that we can bring that natural and working lands conversation to the EJAC? Can you suggest speakers or, sort of what we've done with some of the other topic areas where we brought in folks to provide more topic area expertise, both to the EJAC, but to the folks who come to the EJAC meetings, including CARB board members and staff, to hear some of, what other,
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of coordination. I mean, we've got formal resolutions in both bodies. Both agencies have connected about scheduling this. There was a very narrow window opportunity provided last summer that was deprioritized in favor of, I think it was the LCFS, which rightly so. But I think the time is to reprioritize that strategy, and they're all still very much in communication. So I think there's scenarios within that strategy, and there's an expert that's prepared to speak on each one of them.
Well, then follow up with me so that we can make sure that we get it scheduled and on the agenda.
I'll connect you with the chair over there and the staff.
Great. Additional discussion from the committee on this item? All right. Hearing none and seeing no hands raised at this time on this item, I think that takes us to our public comment period. We will now open up public comment. We ask everyone who's interested to raise their hands on Zoom, or if you're in the room, step to the podium. We'll allow 3 minutes for each commenter. Please state your name and affiliation before you provide your question or comment. Seeing no one in the room, I'll look virtually. I'll give it a moment. Now is the opportunity for public comment. Noting for the record, we have about 50 attendees virtually. And seeing no one at the podium in the room. And seeing no hands raised. We've given it a little bit of time here. All right, I think that concludes public comment for this meeting. That was the general public comment period. That takes us to our next steps and closing remarks. I will move to the co-chairs to see if they'd like to make comments.
Sure, briefly, again, appreciate everybody's presence today. This is Dr. Catherine. Have some speakers again from Carbon Markets and Building Decarb on deck for April and May, but I'll be on sabbatical in March, so good luck, y'all. Martha Dina?
Well, you stepped in while I was on sabbatical, so I'm going to step up and I'm going to rely on a few other members to really step up while you are on sabbatical. Enjoy. It was a lifesaver for me, so I hope it's the same for you. And a couple things I do. Matt, I'm going to have you reach out to me so that we can get the natural and working lands work done together. I don't have any other, burning comments that I want to make to close. So other than stay safe, stay dry. Jill, I'm so sorry it's snowing where you are.
Thank you. We'll turn it over to Carb for any closing remarks.
Thank you, Jill. This is Radhika Majel. I'm the branch chief for Environmental Justice and Equity branch, and I just want to thank everyone for this very constructive conversation today, and kicking off the new year with new priorities and new trends where we all work collaboratively. So really, really looking forward to this year's conversation for all of us. I do want to highlight one thing. We heard about, hey, can you make announcements when you send informations out for events? So let's start today. I'm making an announcement right now for something that you would have received an email shortly from Karina. So this announcement is about the public workshop. It is a virtual public workshop on February 25th. And this workshop is about technical analysis to support the development of a report on hydrogen production and use in California, as it is required by the Senate Bill 1075. This report will cover the deployment, development, and use of hydrogen across all sectors as a key part of achieving the state's climate, air quality, and energy goals. So it's a public workshop. There is a public comment period. We will follow up with an email. Karina will send out the email to entire EJAC, so you have it on your calendars, and you'll get all the details about the notice. So just wanted to highlight that. And thank you all. Have stay dry if you can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. The
Gracias.
time is
Adios,
now.
everybody.
Thank you. The time is now 4:27. We are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.